Hey guys, tonight we step into a morning that feels like the world itself has hit the snooze button. You wake to an unusual hush, that thick, almost tangible silence pressing against your ears, and you know instantly something is different. The sky isn't just gray, it's a steel gray dome that seems to swallow the sun whole. Branches droop as if the trees themselves are holding their breath. You probably won't survive this day unshaken, but that's exactly why you're here, bundled up in your blanket of curiosity. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge out into your street, and the first thing that hits you is how muted everything feels. Cars that usually scream past are muffled, their engines coughing against the thickening air. You step carefully, feeling the chill creep through the thin fabric of your gloves, and notice the quiet almost hurts. Every bird that chirps sounds hesitant, almost apologetic, like they're unsure if it's still safe to sing. Historians still argue whether this eerie morning hush was the calm before a storm or just the natural pause of an unusually cold winter. A neighbor emerges from a doorway, bundled in scarves, squinting against the pale light. You nod, exchanging that universal acknowledgement that yes, we're in this together, but also, wow, this is unreal. A fringe anecdote whispers that in some towns, people paused mid-step to make snow angels right there on sidewalks, convinced the world had gone soft for just a heartbeat. You don't yet, but you can feel the temptation, that childish twinge of let's play in disaster. Smoke curls from chimneys like lazy question marks, unsure whether it should rise or be smothered by the heavy air. You pull your coat tighter, remembering that you have no choice but to face this day. Even as you trudge, a street lamp wavers in the gray, its light haloed by frost. For a second, you imagine it's a lighthouse guiding the last sane people left awake. Inside, your kitchen is cold, every surface slick with condensation, the teapot whistling hesitantly as if it's nervous about joining the morning. You pour yourself tea that steams in slow, ghostly swirls, and take a sip that tastes sharper than usual, like the air itself has flavored it. You remember that one history book saying early warnings of massive snowstorms were often ignored because the morning fog seemed normal, almost mundane. And yet here you are, wrapped in layers, realizing that mundane just got redefined. You step back outside, toes crunching against frost that hasn't yet become snow. You notice a slight shimmer on windows across the street, like ice is knitting tiny gowns for every pane. The gray sky presses down, and for a fleeting moment you question whether you'll ever see the sun again. But then, the wind ruffles your hair in a teasing gesture, almost playful, and you feel that strange thrill of being a witness to something monumental. Footsteps echo differently in this morning hush. Yours sound heavy, deliberate, each one a punctuation mark in the silent scene. You pass a bakery, and the smell of yeast and sugar is almost overpowering in the crisp air. Someone inside needs dough, their movements slow, rhythmic, unconsciously setting a tempo that contrasts with the underlying tension outside. Historians still argue whether urban communities ever truly understood how quickly such a blizzard could escalate. Some argue that people trusted routine weather patterns. Others suggest a failure in communication left them unprepared. The frost on parked cars glints in strange angles, like tiny mirrors reflecting gray light. You bend down, brushing off a corner of the hood, and catch a glimpse of your own eyes, wide, curious, and slightly anxious. A fringe account describes townsfolk in early 20th century blizzards using ice patterns on windows to predict snowfall, almost like reading tea leaves, though no one today could verify such methods. You smile at the thought, brushing a finger along the frost and leaving a temporary streak of warmth in its place. You continue walking, and the city's sounds are filtered through layers of cold. A dog barks far off, muted by distance and wind. A streetcar bell rings somewhere behind a corner, warped, echoing strangely through the empty street. Every ordinary noise is amplified, yet softened, creating a paradoxical clarity that makes you hyper-aware of every detail. The crunch of ice beneath your boots, the soft swish of fabric as your coat flaps against your body, even your own breath-forming clouds that vanish instantly. Passing under a streetlight, you notice a tiny icicle forming along the edge. You tap it lightly with a gloved finger, hearing a delicate chime as a small fragment breaks free and lands in the snow below. This small sound, almost musical, reminds you that beauty persists even in extremity. Fringe anecdotes tell of children in earlier blizzards using similar icicles as makeshift xylophones, an early form of impromptu music therapy. You can't help but wonder if, decades from now, someone will remember these frozen instruments and smile at the absurdity of joy in disaster. By mid-morning, the hush deepens. Even birds have gone silent, retreating to hidden branches. You trudge past familiar storefronts, their windows glinting with frost, interiors dimmed as if the world inside is hesitant to acknowledge the chaos outside. The air bites at your cheeks and nose. Each inhale tastes metallic and sharp. You pull your scarf higher, tucking your chin against it, and feel a sense of isolation tempered only by curiosity and adrenaline. Every step brings a new texture underfoot. Patches of black ice appear beneath the frost, glinting treacherously. You step carefully, feeling the subtle give of frozen slush, and remind yourself to be deliberate. Survival isn't just about enduring the storm. It's about respecting the environment that the storm is creating. You notice small snowdrifts beginning to curl along fences and rooftops, sculpted by gusts that seem intent on painting the city white. As you reach a familiar intersection, you see footprints, some recent, some older, already partially filled by fresh frost. You follow them briefly, trying to imagine who else might have ventured out in the same eerie morning. A fringe note you remember. Some townspeople reported that early snowstorms caused people to unconsciously follow footsteps as a kind of psychological comfort, a reminder that someone else had already navigated the invisible hazards ahead. You laugh quietly at the idea, shivering slightly as a cold gust snakes down the street, threatening to push you off balance. By noon, the gray sky has thickened further. The first faint flurries begin to appear at eye level, drifting lazily, teasing your senses. They're delicate, almost playful, yet you know that this is only the prelude. The morning hush, the muted, tense calm, has begun to give way to the first whispers of what's coming. You pause, tilting your head, letting a single flake land on your glove. It melts instantly, leaving a tiny wet spot, a whisper of impermanence. You realize, with a mix of awe and trepidation, that the world is slowly rewriting itself in white, one flake at a time. By mid-afternoon, the city seems paused. Cars sit abandoned, pedestrians are scarce, and every ordinary movement is slowed by anticipation. You walk past an old church, its steeple reaching into the gray dome above. A bell tolls, muffled by the growing snow, and for a moment you imagine the sound carrying through a world suspended between calm and chaos. Historians still debate whether such atmospheric conditions historically allowed people to detect storms early, or if the seemingly quiet mornings were always deceptive. Finally, as the sun dips low behind that oppressive gray ceiling, you trudge home. Your coat is damp, mittens wet, and every breath steams visibly into the cold air. You glance back at the streets you've crossed and notice how familiar shapes have begun to blur under a thin veil of snow. Even now, the world is preparing for the full blizzard, each flake a tiny herald of what will become monumental. You step inside, close the door against the cold, and feel the moment settle over you. The hush has ended, the playful prelude is fading, and you are about to witness a winter unlike any other. Snow at first, almost playful. You step outside again, toes crunching against the frost that has begun to harden overnight, and you notice the flakes, tiny, delicate, drifting lazily like dancers in a slow, frozen ballet. They land on your eyelashes, on the tip of your nose, and even on your gloves in ways that make you pause and smile. The air carries the subtle scent of ice, sharp and crisp, mixed faintly with the smoky remnants of chimneys. You flick one flake off your sleeve, but another lands immediately, almost mocking you, as if the weather itself is testing your patience. Historians still argue whether the earliest signs of this blizzard were predictable or pure chaos, but at this moment none of that matters. What matters is that the world you knew yesterday is starting to vanish beneath a slowly thickening white veil. The first flakes are teasing, almost delicate. You catch one on your tongue, cold, transient, dissolving instantly. It tastes like memory and winter, reminding you of childhood mornings spent chasing snowballs and tipping tea kettles on cold stoves. You laugh softly to yourself, aware that laughter is a brave act in an uncertain morning. Fringe accounts suggest that in some towns, people press tiny snowflakes against window panes as good luck charms, believing each one would bring a safe winter. You think of doing the same but laugh again at the thought, realizing the absurdity of superstition. The streets begin to blur. Sidewalks vanish under a thin, powdery coat that gradually thickens, and you notice how even the familiar now seems alien. Street lamps flicker through drifting flakes, halos forming around each bulb like luminous crowns. Every sound is muffled. Your own footsteps feel amplified in their silence, a reminder that you are present in a world quietly transforming. A small bird flits low across the street, brushing snow into gentle arcs, and you admire its courage, flying despite the cold and wind. Pedestrians are few, each moving differently in the emerging snow. Some laugh, shuffling through powdery mounds in delight, boots slipping slightly. Others are cautious, leaning into the wind, gripping scarves tightly against their faces. You notice the mix of reactions, playfulness, fear, curiosity, and feel a kinship with them all. The snow is a social equalizer. Everyone faces the same hazards, everyone is momentarily humbled. Historians still debate whether early observers fully comprehended how quickly snow could immobilize entire communities, or whether they underestimated the growing danger. You wander past a bakery, drawn by the scent of warm bread and yeast. Inside, a baker kneads dough slowly, rhythmically, as if performing a ritual of comfort against the world outside. The smell is intoxicating, almost a defiance of the cold, and you pause, savoring the contrast between interior warmth and exterior chill. Fringe reports mention that in certain towns, bakers would deliberately leave ovens slightly open to produce a small heat plume over sidewalks, a combination of charity and a subtle warning of the advancing blizzard. You imagine people following the warm scents, drawn like moths toward light, and feel a strange warmth inside yourself at the thought. The flakes thicken slowly but surely. You notice how they cling to branches, rooftops, and the edges of fences, sculpting each surface into soft, crystalline curves. A streetlight bends slightly under the weight of frost, its bulb flickering, haloed by tiny ice crystals. You run a finger along a frosted window, leaving a streak that melts almost immediately. A quirky historical tidbit suggests that children in similar blizzards sometimes used such streaks to draw maps or leave messages for friends, an early and ephemeral form of communication. You continue walking, toes crunching through accumulating powder, each step taking more effort than the last. The wind picks up, teasing the flakes along the streets and sculpting them into small, intricate drifts. You pause to observe, almost entranced, watching a swirl of snow catch the dim light and sparkle briefly before being absorbed by a larger mound. The dance of wind and snow is hypnotic, a reminder that the environment is alive in its own quiet, deliberate way. Footprints begin to layer over one another. Yours, the few other passers-bys, and the occasional animal print form a chaotic, temporary map across the landscape. A fringe anecdote you remember mentions townspeople in early 20th century storms following tracks as a method of psychological reassurance, a way to confirm that others had successfully navigated the snow. You smile at the thought, following a small trail for a few steps before realizing it leads nowhere significant. By midday, the snow has gained determination. Each flake seems heavier, falling with purpose. You notice a frozen puddle reflecting the gray sky, speckled with white, and for a moment, you wonder if the reflection is more real than the world around it. The wind picks up again, brushing powder against your cheeks, filling your nostrils with a biting chill. You pull your scarf higher, pressing it against your nose and mouth. Each inhalation carries a metallic tang, a reminder that winter is not merely a backdrop. It is a presence, almost a character in its own right. Children still play along the edges of streets and sidewalks. You see small snow tunnels, miniature forts, and playful snowballs tossed with wild abandon. Their laughter pierces the hush of the growing storm, adding light to the gray monotony. Fringe accounts claim that some children carved snow labyrinths deep enough to hide in, playing elaborate games of frozen hide and seek that lasted hours. You pause, imagining yourself sneaking through such a labyrinth, the walls cold against your hands, laughter echoing in the white corridors. As the afternoon stretches on, the snow begins to accumulate in earnest. You lift a foot and sink into drifts that reach your ankles, then calves, each step demanding more effort. You feel your muscles engage, your body adjusting to the growing resistance. The city itself seems to shift, curving into soft, undulating shapes, and familiar streets become unrecognizable. Historians still debate whether townspeople at the time realized how rapidly conditions could change from mild inconvenience to serious threat. You notice stray branches bending under the weight of snow, some snapping with quiet pops. The sound startles you in the otherwise muffled streets. Street signs lean at odd angles, half buried by swirling powder. A stray cat darts across a small alley, its fur dusted with white, eyes wide, tail flicking anxiously as it disappears into a shadowed doorway. You pause, watching it vanish, and feel a strange kinship with creatures navigating the same icy labyrinth. The world is quiet yet dynamic. Snowflakes swirl and drift with purpose, settling in patterns that seem almost deliberate. You kick lightly at a small drift, watching it cascade like a miniature avalanche. The sensation is oddly satisfying, a reminder of simple control in a world increasingly dominated by the blizzard's whims. Fringe observations note that in some historic storms, people developed informal snow games to maintain morale, building forts, sculptures, or tunnels that often persisted only until the next gust reshaped the landscape. You chuckle, imagining communities transformed into playful, impermanent cities of ice. As daylight begins to wane, the snow grows heavier, more insistent. You lift your gaze to the rooftops, noticing chimneys emitting smoke in rhythmic pulses, as if the city itself is breathing against the advancing storm. The soft, muted light refracts through falling snowflakes, turning ordinary objects into ethereal silhouettes. Historians still debate whether early warnings of such blizzards could have been heeded, or if social habits doomed towns to be surprised by the sheer scale of accumulation. By evening, the playful snow of the morning has become a persistent presence, coating every surface in white. Your coat is damp, gloves cold, boots dusted with powder that sticks in clumps. Every step is measured, deliberate, and yet mesmerizing in its monotony. The first real understanding of the storm's scale begins to settle in, and you realize that this gentle, playful flurry was merely the opening movement of something far more monumental. You pause to breathe, letting snowflakes drift lazily onto your scarf. Each flake melts on contact, a fleeting, fragile reminder of impermanence. You glance around at the muted city streets, the soft hum of wind through power lines, the slow swirl of snow over rooftops, and feel both awe and a slight apprehension. The playful snow is giving way to inevitability. The blizzard is asserting itself, and the world is preparing for transformation. You take one final, slow step, feeling the weight of impending change in the soft, unyielding white beneath your boots. Streets become rivers of white. You trudge down avenues that you once thought familiar, only to find that every corner, every curb, every lamppost has been softened and blurred by the relentless accumulation of snow. The sidewalks disappear beneath thickening layers, and asphalt is hidden beneath a pristine, undisturbed mantle of powder. Each step you take sinks slightly, demanding more effort, making you aware of the cold creeping through your boots and the stiffness in your calves. The city, usually so vibrant, now feels like a snow globe, quiet, suspended, and almost surreal. Historians still argue whether urban planning at the time could have anticipated the blizzard's speed, or whether the infrastructure was inherently vulnerable to such extreme weather. The early flurries, playful and teasing in the morning, have transformed into steady, purposeful snowfall. You watch as tiny spirals of powder catch in the dim light, twisting and spinning down from the gray sky above. The flakes cling to every surface, decorating trees and shrubs with delicate, temporary frosting. Branches bend under the growing weight, occasionally cracking with soft, threatening pops. You feel a jolt of anxiety mixed with awe at the realization that nature, in a quiet but deliberate way, is reshaping the cityscape around you. Fringe accounts you've read long ago come back to mind. In some towns, residents believed the snow was a sort of divine prank, coaxing communities into temporary humility. You imagine children running through drifts, throwing snowballs with abandon, while adults watch in disbelief, caught between fear and delight. You yourself feel the urge to scoop up a handful of powder to test its texture, but hesitate, reminding yourself that this is only the beginning. The streets are almost empty. You hear the muffled crunch of your own boots against compacting snow, and it sounds louder than it should, echoing faintly off frozen walls and quiet windows. A stray dog trots past, its paws leaving tiny prints beside your own. You watch it disappear around a corner, tail high, seemingly unbothered by the thickening storm. Historians still debate whether people in earlier blizzards realized the full extent of the danger in these early hours or mistook the initial calm for something benign. A distant church bell tolls slowly, each note softened by the snow-laden air. You pause, letting the sound wash over you, and notice how the city seems suspended in time. Streetcars are stalled on tracks already starting to disappear under drifts. Streetlights cast halos over snow-laden roads, and each reflection in the icy puddles shimmers strangely, almost dreamlike. A fringe tidbit claims that in one northern town, residents believed the snow reflected messages from the heavens, patterns in the drift that could predict the storm's path. An imaginative and unverified anecdote that nevertheless adds a sense of wonder to your walk. As the afternoon drifts on, the snow begins to assert its dominance. Small mounds form along curbs, larger drifts accumulate in corners, and alleyways vanish under a solid white blanket. You pause to admire the way the wind sculpts the powder into miniature dunes, each contour precise, elegant, and fleeting. It's almost hypnotic. You kick at one drift, watching it collapse into a miniature avalanche, and are surprised by the satisfying crunch. A fringe story you recall describes children of earlier blizzards building snow fortresses, tunnels and walls carved meticulously, only to watch them disappear under the next gust, a temporary victory against a persistent force. You continue down what used to be Main Street, now an unrecognizable river of white. Buildings loom faintly through the falling snow, their outlines softened, details erased. Windows are fogged and glazed with frost, each one reflecting a miniature, distorted version of yourself as you pass. You notice handprints left by previous pedestrians slowly being covered by new flakes, an ephemeral record of human presence fading in real time. Historians still debate whether early urban communities fully understood the speed at which their streets and thoroughfares would disappear under relentless snowfall. The wind picks up again, carrying fine powder across your face. You tug your scarf higher, pressing it against your nose and mouth, and feel a shiver crawl along your spine. Each breath tastes metallic, sharp, almost electric. You remember reading that early accounts of historic blizzards often emphasize the sensation of inhaling frozen air. A reminder that snowstorms are not merely visual events, but tactile and olfactory experiences as well. You glance at a lamppost, ice forming in subtle crystals along its length, and notice the faint glitter of frozen water catching stray light, beautiful, dangerous, and ephemeral all at once. A small child bursts from a side alley, cheeks red, eyes wide with delight. They throw a snowball at a friend, who ducks, giggling, and you smile despite the cold biting at your fingertips. Fringe accounts claim that children in earlier storms created elaborate snow labyrinths and tunnels, hiding inside for hours while parents kept watch. You imagine the thrill, the combination of danger and play, and it makes the empty streets feel alive in an unexpected way. Even in the growing storm, pockets of human life assert themselves with laughter, fleeting and defiant. By late afternoon, the snow is deep enough that each step begins to feel like wading through soft sand. You lift your foot, and powder drifts cascade down around your ankles. The city's familiar shapes are gone. Curbs, benches, manhole covers, and small decorative shrubs are all lost beneath an unbroken sheet of white. A stray cat darts across your path, tail twitching, disappearing into a shadowed doorway. Its small footprints are quickly covered by new flakes, a fleeting presence erased almost immediately. You pause, noting how impermanent human and animal movements are compared to the snow's persistence. Traffic is non-existent. Cars sit abandoned, some coated in snow up to their windows. You notice tire tracks partially filled by fresh powder, almost erased, giving a ghostly sense of previous movement. The wind whips around corners, curling flakes into delicate spirals that settle on benches, steps, and street signs. You imagine the city as a blank canvas, every drift and swirl painted by nature's hand. Fringe tales recount that in towns during earlier blizzards, people would try to trace messages in the snow, writing warnings or jokes that were quickly obliterated by the next gust. You pause, tempted to write your own tiny mark, but the cold persuades you to continue walking. By evening, dusk deepens the gray sky, casting a monochromatic filter over everything. Streetlights illuminate flakes in mid-air, turning the falling snow into shimmering curtains. The muffled quiet is almost sacred, broken only by the crunch of your boots and the occasional whisper of wind against frozen windows. Historians still debate whether the initial calm of the snowstorm lulled communities into a false sense of security, or whether the first hours were genuinely as innocuous as they seemed. You round a corner and step into a small park. Benches are buried under a meter or more of snow, trees weighed down by frosted branches. You pause on a path, noticing the delicate layering of footprints left by earlier walkers, some deep, some shallow, already being overwritten by fresh powder. Fringe accounts suggest that in one remote village, a resident remarked that snow created white rivers through towns, carrying with them invisible stories of those who had ventured outside before it accumulated fully. You smile, feeling a strange sense of connection to those long-past observers, each human presence as fleeting as the flakes themselves. The world is growing quiet again, heavier now, almost reverent. Snow continues to accumulate relentlessly, softening edges, muffling sound, and rendering familiar landmarks unrecognizable. Each breath feels sharper, the air denser, yet mesmerizing in its purity. You lift your head and watch the snow swirl, forming spirals and miniature drifts that seem almost intentional. The playful first flakes of the morning have been replaced by an insistent, persistent force, a reminder that nature is both artist and tyrant in the same breath. By nightfall, the river of white has swallowed nearly every indication of the city's prior form. Streets, alleyways, parks, and sidewalks now merge into one unbroken expanse of snow. You feel each step more heavily, the effort of walking against resistance creating a rhythm that matches the blizzard's insistent tempo. Footprints layer, vanish, and are replaced again, evidence of human presence, impermanent and fragile against the snow's permanence. You pause to gaze across an empty square, imagining the invisible currents of wind sculpting drifts, and feel the humbling awareness that even a city's bustling life is fleeting in the face of such a storm. Snowflakes land on your hair, eyelashes, and gloves, some melting instantly, others sticking stubbornly. You run a gloved hand over a drift and notice the soft crunch of powder compressed into icy granules. The smell of cold air, faint smoke from distant chimneys, and the subtle scent of frozen earth combine into a sensory cocktail that anchors you to the moment. Fringe stories whisper about early townspeople interpreting these subtle changes, the smell, the texture, the layering of snow, as omens or guides for action, creating an informal, almost mystical knowledge system. You shiver, partly from cold, partly from wonder, and continue walking, fully aware that this is only the beginning. The city is now entirely transformed. Each building's edges softened, each street unrecognizable. The initial charm of playful flakes has given way to a more commanding presence. You trudge on, appreciating the strangeness of it all, realizing that every step, every breath, every observation is part of an unfolding narrative that has been written by snow and wind. The river of white is relentless, persistent, and beautiful in a way that both captivates and humbles you. You are a small witness to a world remade, the city submerged in an almost hypnotic monochrome quietude that hints at the chaos to come. Trains stall, engines groan. You make your way to the station, drawn by the low, anxious whistle of locomotives struggling to resist the grip of snow. Platforms are nearly deserted, benches coated in powder, and tracks disappearing beneath an unrelenting white tide. Steam rises from engines in twisting, curling columns, freezing mid-air into delicate, ghostly ribbons that vanish before you can fully appreciate their transient beauty. Historians still debate whether railway operators at the time could have anticipated how quickly snow would immobilize entire networks, or whether the systems were doomed to fail in such extreme conditions. You trudge closer, toes crunching in deepening powder, and notice the anxious expressions of passengers clinging to scarves and coats. Some peer at the schedule boards as if numbers alone could shield them from the growing storm, while others huddle together, whispering quietly to pass the tension. A fringe anecdote drifts into your mind. A station master in a rural outpost reportedly initiated a spontaneous snowball fight with stranded travelers, either to distract them from panic or as an eccentric method of morale boosting. You imagine the absurdity, the sight of snowflakes bouncing off hats and boots, and feel a wry smile despite the icy wind on your face. The trains themselves seem almost alive. Wheels spin against frozen rails, grinding, squealing, hissing, struggling against invisible resistance. You watch engineers wipe frost from windows, breath fogging the glass in delicate clouds, the steam curling in eerie, frozen formations above each engine. You feel a thrill of admiration and empathy, imagining the struggle of pushing massive steel machines through an environment that feels designed to resist them. Historians still argue whether winter preparedness at that time could have realistically prevented such paralysis, or if human limitations made such disasters inevitable. A small child tugs at their mother's coat, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. You notice a lantern swinging gently from a station roof, its flickering glow haloed by frost, casting warm patterns on snow-laden platforms. Fringe accounts describe early travelers claiming that the steam from locomotives would crystallize into shapes resembling tiny snowbirds or abstract creatures. A fanciful observation, scientifically improbable, yet enchanting all the same. You imagine the steam freezing mid-dance above the train, lantern light refracting off each icy spiral. You move along the platforms, noting abandoned luggage half buried in powder. Each bag tells a story: hurried escapes, misadventures, plans halted. The snow is methodically erasing the normal order of life, creating a suspended, ghostly tableau. Wind snakes around corners, carrying the sharp smell of coal from the engines and the metallic tang of snow. You inhale deeply, feeling the cold bite at your lungs while appreciating the raw sensory clarity this storm provides. Even the smell of smoke feels electric, almost alive. Tracks stretch into the distance, swallowed gradually by snowdrifts forming like miniature dunes across the rails. The rhythmic hiss and cough of engines becomes an orchestral statement, a relentless insistence that nature will decide the day's tempo. You imagine yourself aboard a stranded train, pressing your palm against a window, watching the snowy landscape creep ever closer, feeling simultaneously trapped and hypnotically drawn into its white embrace. Fringe stories suggest that passengers sometimes carved intricate snow sculptures around their stranded carriages, turning desperation into a temporary art form. You smile at the thought, human ingenuity against relentless weather. The wind cuts through open sections of platform, swirling loose powder into thin, icy ribbons that whip across your face. You pull your scarf higher and shiver, realizing that survival is about more than just warmth. It's about attention, awareness, and small acts of patience. The snow gathers in corners and under benches, creating uneven surfaces that shift beneath each step. Even the act of walking becomes a negotiation with the elements, a subtle dance between human intent and winter's authority. You glance up the tracks, visualizing other trains, other passengers, other struggles beyond your immediate line of sight. The blizzard doesn't stop at one station. It stretches across the landscape, folding urban and rural areas into a single white expanse. Historians still argue whether the nationwide or regional railway systems at that time had effective communication networks for such emergencies, or whether delays were compounded by technological and bureaucratic shortcomings. You feel a creeping awareness of your own smallness within this broader scene, a tiny observer in a vast, unrelenting winter. A few stray children appear near a partially buried waiting area, their laughter cracking through the muted scene. They dart between pillars, kicking snow, and creating tiny clouds that drift lazily upward. Fringe accounts from early 20th century storms note that children often engaged in spontaneous snow battles at stations, a combination of mischief and adrenaline that made them small, ephemeral agents of chaos. You watch them, smiling, as their fleeting joy contrasts with the monumental task facing the engineers and travelers. As afternoon turns into early evening, the snow intensifies. Flakes fall more densely now, occasionally caught in the lantern light, casting flickering, otherworldly patterns across the platform. The engines groan louder under the strain, their whistles shrill, carrying faintly across the drifting streets and buildings. You notice icicles forming along the edges of the roofs, some already reaching a foot in length, threatening to snap with the weight of the storm. Each detail, the frosted windows, the frozen columns of steam, the growing drifts, adds a sense of scale to the blizzard, an almost cinematic realization of nature's dominance. You pause to observe a single track that stretches beyond view. It's nearly buried, but you can see faint rail lines beneath the snow. A strange, whimsical thought crosses your mind. If trains were ships, these tracks would be invisible rivers, carrying vessels stranded in white oceans. You laugh softly at the absurdity, but the thought lingers. Fringe accounts from the era even describe stranded passengers imagining the trains as ghost ships drifting in white seas, a shared metaphor for being trapped yet alive, caught in a liminal world between safety and peril. The wind picks up again, sweeping across the platform in sharp gusts that carry loose powder into your hair, into your scarf, biting at your cheeks. You adjust your hat, feeling the cold seep deeper into your layers. Steam curls from chimneys and vents, freezing mid-ascent, forming intricate crystalline shapes. The visual poetry of the scene contrasts sharply with the anxiety in the air, the tension between beauty and danger heightened by every gust. Historians still debate whether these early visual observations of snow and ice offered meaningful guidance to engineers and travelers, or whether they were largely aesthetic distractions in the midst of growing peril. You trudge past a pile of snow-laden luggage, glancing down at footprints leading away from the waiting area. Each print is quickly obliterated by drifting powder, erased before you can follow its story. You notice the rhythm of the engines, the sigh of metal against snow, and the ghostly ribbons of steam curling around lamp posts. Every element seems orchestrated by winter itself, a precise, patient conductor directing human activity into quiet compliance. Night begins to fall, and the sky darkens to an inky gray. Snow swirls in thick curtains, partially obscuring the view of distant buildings. You step carefully along the platform, noting the shapes of abandoned carriages, the faint glow of lanterns reflected in icy puddles. The scene is both eerie and mesmerizing. Fringe stories tell of passengers carving small tunnels through drifts surrounding stranded trains, creating tiny shelters in the snow, a combination of survival instinct and playful resourcefulness. You imagine crawling through one of these temporary havens, the cold outside pressing against your makeshift walls, a fragile cocoon against the storm. The station feels isolated now. Each gust of wind carries the faint, distant whistle of a stalled train, the muffled crunch of snow settling on rooftops, and the occasional shout of an engineer or traveler. The blizzard, relentless and persistent, is asserting its authority over human schedules, intentions, and routines. You feel both awe and a small shiver of fear, aware that this is only a fraction of the disruption yet to come. You pause, letting your gaze drift down the tracks that disappear into a white haze. The snow continues to swirl, curling in miniature tornadoes around lamp posts and benches. You notice the way the light catches individual flakes, each one suspended momentarily in space before settling. It's hypnotic, almost meditative, but beneath the beauty, the threat is clear. You are aware that trains, towns, and lives are now subject to an invisible but absolute power, the blizzard. By nightfall, the station has become a surreal tableau. Snow-draped benches, half-buried luggage, steam frozen mid-flight, lantern light haloed by frost. The groaning engines, frozen tracks, and swirling powder create a scene both cinematic and haunting. You realize that what began as playful flakes hours ago has transformed into a persistent, commanding force. You trudge home from the station, boots thick with slush, gloves soaked, cheeks stinging. Each step reminds you of the storm's power and the city's growing submission to its weight. The blizzard is no longer just weather. It is a narrative, a moving, breathing character rewriting streets, tracks, and routines. You lift your head to catch a few flakes on your eyelashes, melt them on your tongue, and marvel at their fleeting beauty. Even amid discomfort, you feel a sense of reverence for the storm's scale, its relentlessness, and its capacity to transform an ordinary day into something extraordinary. You return home, exhausted yet strangely exhilarated. The station, the stalled trains, the swirling snow, and the distant city lights have all become part of a larger tableau in your memory. Tonight, you realize, you are a witness to history, to a blizzard that will leave tracks not only on streets and rails, but in the stories of survival and human endurance. The engines groan in your imagination, the snow curls in your mind, and you feel the first deep understanding of how vast and unstoppable winter can be. You leave the city behind, trudging along country roads now nearly invisible under a thickening blanket of snow. The landscape has transformed into an unbroken sea of white, each fence post, tree, and rock softened, partially swallowed or entirely erased. The wind pushes against you, insistent and cold, flinging powder into your eyelashes and down the back of your coat. Every breath tastes metallic, sharp, almost electric. You realize with a small thrill and a jolt of anxiety that this is no ordinary snowfall. Historians still argue whether the sudden accumulation in rural areas could have been predicted, or if these farms were simply caught unprepared, isolated in a white wilderness. Along the roads, you see farmhouses half hidden under snow. Roofs sag slightly under the weight, chimneys emit curling wisps of smoke, and frost patterns spread across windows like intricate lace. You notice an old barn, its doors half covered in powder, the outline softened to a vague rectangle. A fringe anecdote you read years ago returns to mind. In one remote town, farmers reported that snow piled so high against barns that livestock created faint tunnels through drifts to reach food. You imagine cows and horses gingerly navigating these icy corridors, heads low, breath forming clouds in the frigid air. You trudge through fields now invisible beneath snow. Corn stalks lie flattened, ghostly outlines barely discernible beneath powder. The landscape seems almost ethereal, a monochromatic dream. Your boots sink deeper with every step, and the effort makes you acutely aware of your own presence in this vast, frozen expanse. A fringe observation claims that in some early storms, farmers would leave small markers in fields, sticks, flags, or simple piles of stones, to locate fences, paths, or livestock after the snow had settled. You find yourself scanning for similar markers, the landscape both mesmerizing and disorienting. Wind sculpts the snow into smooth undulations, soft waves that stretch across the open land. Each drift catches light differently, forming temporary patterns that vanish as the storm continues its relentless sculpting. You pause for a moment, letting the wind whip against your face, and you are reminded that in winter, even ordinary landscapes can seem otherworldly, almost alive. Historians still debate whether rural communities truly comprehended how quickly blizzards could immobilize entire regions, or if survival was largely a matter of improvisation and instinct. Farmhouses appear like islands in a frozen sea. Smoke from chimneys rises lazily, only to be caught in the swirling flurries and blown back down toward the roof. You imagine families inside, cheeks pink from heat, eyes wide as the storm presses against windows and doors. The scene feels timeless. A fringe account describes an elderly farmer using a long wooden pole to sweep snow from the roof of his home, muttering about white invaders, while a nearby dog sniffed cautiously at drifting drifts that threatened to block the front gate. You chuckle quietly at the mental image, shivering as another gust sends fine snow into your scarf. The tracks you follow along country lanes are increasingly buried. Fences emerge as faint, undulating lines, sometimes disappearing entirely. You step carefully, mindful of hidden ditches, frost-heaved earth, or trapped puddles. Each step is both an act of navigation and an exercise in patience, the snow stubbornly resisting every movement. Fringe stories suggest that some families would tie ropes between posts to create snow corridors, guiding people safely from house to barn, from food storage to livestock shelters, a simple ingenuity born of necessity. You pass a small orchard, apple trees bowed beneath ice and snow. Frost patterns shimmer on branches like delicate glass sculptures. The fallen snow muffles the world, softening edges, silencing sounds. You notice a bird perched tentatively, feathers fluffed, head bobbing as if unsure whether it is safe to stay. Historians still argue whether rural wildlife suffered immediate losses, or whether some species adapted surprisingly well to sudden, deep snowfall. You watch the bird take flight in a flurry of white, disappearing into the haze, a small reminder that life continues amid chaos. Fields stretch endlessly, a frozen ocean with only the faintest lines marking past activity, plowed rows, remnants of last season's harvest, half-buried fence posts. You pause, bending down to touch the snow. It is cold, soft, powdery, yet dense, compacting slightly under pressure, holding the shape of your glove for an instant before slowly rebounding. A fringe tale you remember describes children in earlier storms using snow to insulate small animals, building temporary snow burrows around them to protect against the cold. You imagine these tiny acts of care and ingenuity, ephemeral yet profoundly human. The wind gusts again, stronger now, flinging powder in sharp arcs. You brace against it, boots sinking deeper, gloves stiff with cold. The monotony of the endless white is hypnotic, yet every step carries tension, the awareness that even minor missteps could send you into hidden ditches or ice-covered furrows. Snow begins to gather in drifts along the sides of houses, gradually forming small hills against doors and windows. You pause at a farmhouse porch, peering at the door nearly obscured by powder, imagining the effort needed to clear a path. Fringe accounts describe people using shovels, sticks, and sometimes bare hands to carve corridors through deep drifts, each cleared pathway a temporary victory against the storm. Smoke rises in gentle curls from multiple chimneys across the farms, tiny signals of life in the white expanse. You imagine families huddled near stoves, the aroma of bread or stew filling warm interiors. The contrast between interior comfort and exterior chaos is palpable. Historians still debate whether rural communities fully anticipated the speed at which storms could trap them, or whether improvisation and resilience were the only tools they could rely upon. You shiver, realizing that each gust, each swirl of snow, is both a threat and a reminder of nature's persistent power. You notice a herd of cattle in a distant field, partially obscured by rising drifts. They move slowly, carefully, heads low, leaving faint trails behind them. A fringe story suggests that in some early blizzards, livestock learned to follow paths cleared by previous animals, a small, organic guidance system. You marvel at the resilience embedded in these creatures, moving steadily, quietly, in harmony with the white expanse surrounding them. The sun, low in the sky, casts a muted, silvery glow across the snowy fields. The light catches flakes mid-descent, turning them into miniature stars suspended in space. The effect is surreal, almost magical, a transient beauty that is at once hypnotic and humbling. You pause, taking in the tableau. Snow-laden fields, half-buried barns, curling smoke, distant livestock, and the wind sculpting everything into shifting shapes. Each element feels deliberate, part of a narrative authored by winter itself. A small child emerges from a farmhouse doorway, bundled tightly in scarves and coats, cheeks red from the cold. They stomp around a drift, laughing, attempting to catch flakes with mittened hands. Fringe accounts from similar historical blizzards report children engaging in elaborate snow games, building forts or tiny tunnels, turning necessity into creativity. You watch the child run back inside, the sound of laughter swallowed immediately by the white expanse, a fleeting reminder of life persisting amid overwhelming snow. By late afternoon, snowdrifts have begun to grow taller than your knees in places. Every step requires effort, balance, and attention. The wind whips with increasing force, forming miniature spirals around fence posts and tree trunks. Farm structures are almost fully blanketed, with only roof lines and chimneys giving clues to their presence. You trudge along a half-hidden path, marveling at the power of accumulation, the way snow reshapes landscapes with both subtlety and inevitability. Historians still argue whether these accumulations could have been prevented by earlier clearing, or if the sheer scale of precipitation was simply unavoidable. Night falls, turning the white expanse into a soft, gray-tinged world. Snow continues to fall, heavier now, relentless. You pause atop a small rise, looking down across fields and farms, feeling the enormity of the storm pressing against every building, every fence, every living creature. Smoke from chimneys wavers in the gusts, fading into the gray sky. The wind carries the soft, distant lowing of cattle, the faint cry of a dog, and the occasional echo of human voices struggling to be heard over the blizzard's insistence. You take a deep breath, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of snow and ice. Your boots are wet, gloves stiff, and yet you feel a curious exhilaration, an awareness that you are witnessing a transformation of entire communities, fields, and lives under the unyielding power of nature. The blizzard has moved from playful flurries to a force that commands attention, reshaping not just the landscape but the rhythm of life itself. You pause, absorbing the scene, aware that this is only the beginning of an even larger story of survival, adaptation, and resilience in the face of relentless winter. The vast, relentless power of towns feels strangely small now, like fragile bubbles caught in a vast, white storm. You walk along streets where buildings are half hidden beneath thickening drifts, each roof sagging under snow that seems determined to stay. Sidewalks vanish beneath powder that crunches beneath your boots, leaving you aware of every step. A gust of wind sweeps across the street, carrying powder in sharp arcs that sting your cheeks and fill your nostrils with the cold, metallic tang of winter. Historians still debate whether early townsfolk fully grasped how quickly a blizzard could turn streets, homes, and entire neighborhoods into unrecognizable landscapes. You notice shuttered shops and darkened windows, the faint glow of lanterns peeking from interiors where families huddle against the cold. Smoke curls from chimneys in slow, twisting columns, frozen mid-air by the harsh temperatures, forming delicate crystalline shapes. Fringe accounts from similar blizzards report townspeople using smoke signals as a form of communication across short distances, a creative improvisation when roads became impassable. You imagine the coded wafts drifting between houses, subtle messages of safety, warnings, or simple companionship. The wind shifts, carrying fine powder into your hair and eyes. You pull your scarf higher, pressing it against your nose and mouth, and feel the cold seeping into layers of clothing. Each breath is sharp, almost electric, a reminder that winter is not passive. It is a presence that demands attention, patience, and awareness. You trudge past the remains of a town square, benches buried, fountains frozen solid beneath icy blankets, and street signs half covered in drifts. The familiar markers of everyday life are now ghostly hints of what once was. Children emerge from doorways, laughter piercing the muted scene, muffled by scarves and snow. They dart through small drifts, throwing powder at one another, cheeks bright against the white expanse. Fringe stories suggest that in early 20th century storms, children created elaborate tunnels and forts from snow near their homes, turning survival into ephemeral games. You watch them, smiling despite the harsh cold, imagining yourself joining the chaotic fun before the weight of the storm reminds you of its authority. You pass a town fountain now transformed into a crystalline sculpture. Icicles hang like sharp teeth from the edges, frost covering every surface, and a thin layer of ice creaks under the pressure of settling snow. The world has grown both beautiful and dangerous, delicate and unyielding. Historians still argue whether early urban architecture was sufficiently prepared for prolonged snowfall, or if the cumulative weight and cold would inevitably compromise structures. You step carefully, mindful of hidden hazards under the soft, deceptive powder. Shops are shuttered, some abandoned mid-task. You peek through a frosted window at a small bakery, flour dust suspended in the air, half-formed loaves on a counter, the warm glow of an oven in contrast to the relentless cold outside. Fringe accounts describe early residents improvising oven sharing, inviting neighbors to warm themselves and bake bread together during heavy storms, a temporary reprieve from isolation. You smile, imagining the cozy interiors alive with conversation, heat, and the smells of freshly baked bread while the town outside succumbs to white stillness. The streets themselves are deceptive. Beneath seemingly smooth powder lie icy patches, hidden potholes, and forgotten debris. Every step requires attention, the crunch of snow underfoot masking dangers just below the surface. Wind swirls snow into unexpected drifts, creating miniature hills, valleys, and sudden barriers. You navigate cautiously, aware that each drift is both obstacle and feature of this frozen landscape, and each gust could shift the scene entirely in moments. A stray cat darts across the street, fur dusted with snow, eyes wide and alert. It pauses atop a small drift, glancing around before disappearing behind a half-buried fence. You follow its fleeting presence, recognizing how animals adapt instinctively while humans struggle with planning, caution, and improvisation. Fringe stories recount that animals often became guides for townsfolk during historic blizzards, leading them along partially cleared paths or alerting them to hidden dangers. You feel a quiet kinship with the cat, both of you navigating an environment increasingly hostile and unpredictable. You pass a small church, the steeple barely visible through the swirling snow. Icicles hang along its edges like crystalline ornaments, and the bell tower is partially obscured by powdery drifts. Inside, a single candle flickers, casting a warm halo against frosted windows. Historians still debate whether early communities relied on churches as literal and symbolic centers of refuge during blizzards, or if reliance was overstated in contemporary accounts. Fringe anecdotes describe congregants improvising meals, sharing warmth, and telling stories late into the night, maintaining morale while snow accumulated relentlessly outside. The wind gusts harder now, carrying fine particles of snow across your face and stinging exposed skin. You press on, boots sinking deeper with each step, feeling the effort in your calves, thighs, and shoulders. Even routine movements become deliberate negotiations with the storm. Small alleyways are completely buried, and familiar shortcuts vanish under powder that swirls unpredictably. You marvel at how quickly a bustling town can be rendered alien, disorienting, and magical all at once. A dog barks in the distance, the sound muted yet piercing in the white silence. You notice faint tracks leading toward a half-buried house, the remnants of someone navigating the storm before you. Fringe reports mention that in early blizzards, townspeople followed such tracks to find neighbors, ensuring safety or delivering messages. You step carefully along a similar path, imagining the invisible network of guidance, caution, and human ingenuity woven across the town. Streetlights cast long, distorted halos through the falling snow. You pause beneath one, brushing snow from your hat, and notice the way flakes catch in the halo, forming miniature constellations of temporary light. The effect is almost hypnotic, a visual lullaby of sorts, yet the cold bites at your cheeks, grounding you in the tangible threat outside. Historians still debate whether the combination of limited artificial light and relentless snowfall exacerbated disorientation, or whether communities quickly adapted to visual challenges through memory, markers, and shared knowledge. You round a corner and find yourself in a residential area. Houses are partially obscured, snow heaped against doors, roofs bending slightly under weight. Smoke curls from chimneys, carrying faint smells of wood fires, bread, and stew into the biting wind. Children's laughter emerges sporadically from doorways, echoing briefly before being swallowed by the blizzard. Fringe accounts describe families building temporary tunnels between homes, creating small, interconnected pathways to avoid long exposure to the storm. You imagine carefully navigating one of these corridors, the tactile feedback of snow walls guiding your way, creating ephemeral yet vital connections. By early evening, the town feels suspended in time. Each building, street, and tree has been softened, distorted, and partially hidden by relentless snow. Footprints layer and vanish quickly, marking human presence only briefly before being erased. The snow seems both artist and archivist, leaving behind fleeting records of activity that will disappear almost as quickly as they appear. Historians still debate whether the speed of accumulation created permanent hazards, or whether the storm's unpredictability made long-term preparation largely impossible. You stop atop a small rise, gazing down across the town. The lights of homes glow softly through snow-laden windows, smoke rising in slow, curling columns. Streets are white, undulating, almost sculptural, the familiar grid hidden beneath waves of powder. The effect is hypnotic, beautiful, and daunting. Fringe stories describe residents marking critical points, doors, wells, and supply caches, with poles, ropes, or small flags, creating temporary maps in a transformed landscape. You pause, appreciating the ingenuity that allows humans to assert control, however small, against overwhelming natural forces. The wind grows colder and more insistent. Snow swirls around your legs, brushing your gloves, slipping beneath your coat. You pull your scarf higher, feeling the cold bite at your cheeks, your neck, your exposed skin. Each gust carries sound differently. The muffled crunch of snow underfoot, distant animal calls, and the faint, eerie groan of buildings flexing under weight. Even as the town seems frozen in suspended animation, subtle signs of life persist. Smoke curling, animals moving cautiously, children peeking from doorways. By nightfall, the blizzard dominates the town entirely. Streets, alleys, and fields are unrecognizable, the familiar replaced by soft, undulating forms. Every roof bears weight, every chimney emits delicate smoke, every window glows faintly against the gray-tinged snow. You feel small, fragile, yet alive within this vast, transformed environment. The town is suspended between calm and chaos, a temporary kingdom ruled by the blizzard's quiet, unyielding authority. You breathe deeply, tasting the sharp, metallic tang of snow and ice. Every step, every sound, every observation is a small act of awareness, a negotiation with the storm's relentlessness. You pause to watch flakes drift lazily, yet insistently, across the glow of a street lamp. The blizzard has reshaped the town, its people, and its routines. And in this frozen, hushed landscape, you sense the first whispers of the challenges to come. The isolation, the persistence, and the struggle for warmth, safety, and human connection against winter. The wind howls like a living thing as you move into the outskirts of the town. The edges of familiar streets vanish beneath drifts that have become almost sculptural, curling into miniature waves and ridges that shift with every gust. Each step is laborious. Your boots sink into soft powder that resists movement, while ice hidden beneath the snow threatens subtle slips. You glance at the horizon and see only white, the town swallowed gradually into the blizzard's growing dominion. Historians still debate whether local authorities could have anticipated how rapidly these peripheral areas would be rendered inaccessible, or if the storm simply outpaced any reasonable preparation. Small clusters of homes appear like islands in a frozen sea. Roofs sag under weight, windows are frosted over, and smoke curls lazily from chimneys, forming delicate, twisting ribbons that the wind immediately disrupts. Fringe accounts from early 20th century blizzards describe families improvising tunnels through drifts to reach neighbors, often carrying essentials like wood, bread, or milk, creating ephemeral networks of survival in white, shifting landscapes. You imagine navigating such a tunnel yourself, the snow walls cold and firm under gloved hands, the muffled sounds of distant voices carrying encouragement and humor through the storm. You trudge past a half-buried fence, a stark reminder that human structures are temporary against the blizzard's persistence. Snow forms subtle patterns over the wooden posts, smoothing edges and erasing imperfections. The wind gusts again, sending flurries into your eyes, and you squint through the swirl, catching glimpses of a distant barn nearly consumed by drifts. You notice the faint outline of livestock inside, moving cautiously, heads low, navigating narrow passages carved by previous storms or human ingenuity. Historians still argue whether rural communities truly understood the vulnerability of their outbuildings, or if survival relied largely on experience and instinct. A dog trots past, tail high, leaving delicate paw prints that are quickly covered by new snow. You follow its fleeting tracks, appreciating how animals navigate the storm intuitively, while humans struggle against unfamiliar terrain. Fringe tales recount that during early blizzards, dogs and other domestic animals often acted as guides, alerting owners to hidden hazards or leading them toward shelter, forming an informal partnership between humans and nature. You watch the dog disappear into a drift, vanishing almost immediately, leaving only a whisper of movement behind. Smoke curls from chimneys in slow, deliberate patterns, each column bending under the wind's pressure. You imagine families inside, cheeks flushed from warmth, seated around small fires, sharing stories and maintaining morale while the storm tightens its grip outside. Fringe anecdotes describe makeshift signal fires in rural blizzards, faint columns of smoke sent to alert neighbors of safe passage or to communicate simple messages. You visualize these ghostly markers rising from snow-covered roofs, a quiet network of human ingenuity resisting isolation. The fields surrounding the outskirts are an endless white expanse. Every plowed row, every fence line, every tree has been softened or obscured, leaving a surreal, featureless landscape. You pause to run your hand through the snow, feeling its weight and texture, powdery at the surface, compacted underneath, cold enough to draw breath in a sharp, metallic tang. Fringe accounts suggest that farmers used similar tactile methods to detect boundaries, fences, or hidden ditches, teaching each generation a practical literacy of snow and ice. You marvel at the quiet intelligence required to read the landscape in this transformed state. You trudge past a small orchard, branches bending under the snow's weight, icicles forming like jagged jewelry along the edges. A single bird perches tentatively, feathers fluffed, head bobbing as if deciding whether to flee or remain. Historians still debate whether rural wildlife adapted well to sudden, deep snow or suffered significant losses, with early observations often contradicting one another. Fringe stories describe birds huddling collectively in dense trees or near barns, conserving heat and navigating paths created by human and animal movement alike. You watch the bird take flight, its small shadow flicking across the snow in a fleeting, ephemeral moment. The wind intensifies, whipping loose powder into arcs that sting your face and fill your scarf. Each step is an effort, boots sink, gloves stiffen, and the cold bites deeper. You notice small drifts forming against doors and under windows, gradually swallowing the first stories of houses. Families are likely inside, bracing, improvising, conserving heat and energy, while the storm continues its patient work of transformation. Fringe accounts describe households building internal snow walls or temporary corridors inside barns and homes to protect livestock or maintain warmth. You imagine crouching inside one of these snow-protected spaces, hearing the muffled pulse of life outside the thick white veil. A distant tractor, abandoned mid-field, is nearly buried. Its metal frame is softened by snow, and tracks leading up to it are almost invisible. You consider the impossibility of moving it without significant effort or the right tools. Historians still argue whether mechanized equipment could have realistically aided farmers during sudden blizzards, or whether the rapid accumulation of snow rendered such technology ineffective. Fringe tales speak of neighbors working collectively to dig vehicles out, a temporary truce between human ingenuity and winter's relentless authority. You pass a small bridge over a creek, the flowing water beneath partially frozen, edged with thick ice and drifts. Snow swirls along the banks, forming miniature cliffs, tunnels, and arches that shift subtly with the wind. You imagine children playing here in earlier storms, carefully navigating ice and snow to create ephemeral games, while adults watch, both anxious and amused. Historians still debate whether the dangers of frozen waterways were fully appreciated or whether familiarity bred complacency, with sometimes tragic results. By late afternoon, the outskirts feel suspended in time. Each building is partially obscured, each field transformed, each pathway hidden beneath unbroken white. Footprints layer and vanish quickly, marking human presence only briefly before being erased by drifting snow. Smoke from chimneys creates faint trails through swirling powder, suggesting life persists, fragile but defiant. Fringe accounts note that these subtle signals allowed neighbors to locate one another or verify that households remained safe, a quiet network of vigilance born of necessity. You climb a small rise to observe the landscape. Farmhouses appear like distant islands, smoke curling above rooftops, livestock moving cautiously, and fields stretching endlessly in all directions. The snow molds every feature into abstract forms, sculpting the environment with patience and authority. You pause, letting the hypnotic rhythm of wind and powder wash over you, each gust reshaping your perception of distance and space. Historians still debate whether these peripheral areas were more vulnerable than towns, or if isolation paradoxically allowed residents to respond with greater flexibility and improvisation. Night falls, the gray sky darkening, the wind now carrying a fine, sharp powder that whips across drifts and fields. You trudge carefully, every step demanding attention, boots sinking deeper, muscles straining. Streetlights and lanterns glow faintly against snow-laden windows, casting halos and shadows that shift with every gust. Fringe accounts describe rural lighting improvisations, lanterns hung along fences or from poles to guide travelers or livestock through the accumulating snow, a temporary, delicate system of survival. You stop, catching your breath, and look across a vast field. The outlines of barns, fences, and distant trees are softened, almost indistinguishable. The wind sculpts drifts into waves and ridges that seem to move imperceptibly, a quiet, relentless choreography. Smoke rises from a few chimneys, fragile spirals dissolving into the whiteness. You realize that you are a small observer in a vast, transformed landscape, a witness to human endurance and the quiet, inescapable authority of winter. By nightfall, the outskirts are nearly unrecognizable. Drifts swallow fences, roofs, and pathways, muffling sound and isolating households. You notice faint tracks, human and animal, layering, vanishing, and reappearing as the wind reshapes the surface. Children's laughter, distant barks, and the lowing of livestock punctuate the otherwise silent landscape. Fringe stories note that people often worked collectively in these peripheral areas, sharing warmth, food, and shelter, improvising strategies for survival in a white wilderness. You take a deep breath, the cold metallic air filling your lungs, tasting sharp and electric. Your boots are soaked, gloves stiff, cheeks burning, yet you feel an exhilaration born of observing both the beauty and the relentlessness of nature. Every drift, every gust, every faint plume of smoke is part of a larger narrative. The storm's assertion over land, towns, and farms, the quiet acts of human ingenuity, and the ephemeral traces of life persisting in the snow. You pause for a moment, aware that this is just the beginning of the blizzard's total dominion, the next hours promising even deeper accumulation, isolation, and struggle. You find yourself back on the main roads, heading toward the train lines that have become silent arteries of paralysis. The town is behind you, now a muted, snowy silhouette, and ahead stretches open countryside where tracks are gradually swallowed by drifts. Each step is heavier than the last. Boots sink past your ankles into powder that resists movement, shifting subtly underfoot. The wind is relentless, carrying fine crystalline particles that sting your face and fill every exposed crevice. Historians still debate whether the railway infrastructure of the era was prepared for such extreme winter conditions, or if planners simply underestimated nature's fury. The tracks ahead vanish beneath the snow like a vanishing river. Wooden ties peek occasionally through powder, while rails are coated in frost so thick they gleam silver under the dim light. You imagine engineers trying to clear these lines, shovels in hand, steam engines hissing and groaning, wheels spinning against ice that refuses to yield. Fringe accounts tell of early railway workers literally using bonfires alongside the rails to melt ice and snow, the heat warping metal and creating temporary, unpredictable hazards. You shiver at the thought, both amused and awed by human determination against relentless elements. Alongside the tracks, abandoned freight cars lie partially buried. You step carefully around them, boots sinking deep in the powder as you imagine the loads they carry. Food, coal, mail, essentials now stranded in snow. Smoke from nearby chimneys twists into spirals, sometimes mistaken for steam from engines struggling to restart. Historians still argue whether distribution networks could have adapted quickly enough to prevent shortages, or if entire regions were inevitably isolated until the storm passed. A whistle sounds faintly in the distance, muffled by snow and wind. You pause, straining to hear, realizing that the sound itself is distorted, carrying eerie tones unlike those of a normal train. Fringe stories from previous blizzards claim that distant whistles often sounded ghostly, leading some travelers to believe in phantom trains wandering the snowy plains. You chuckle quietly, imagining spectral locomotives moving silently across frozen tracks, their cargoes of disrupted schedules and stranded travelers invisible to the eye. The wind shifts, swirling snow into miniature tornadoes along the tracks. You notice the accumulation forming ridges that rise unexpectedly, covering small obstacles and creating deceptive surfaces. One misstep could send you plunging into a hidden ditch, or into the snowbank against which freight cars lean precariously. Fringe reports from the era describe engineers leaving markers along the tracks to warn travelers and crews, ephemeral lines of guidance buried and revealed by each gust. You follow one faint trail, aware that every step is a negotiation with the storm itself. You come across a partially cleared section of line, where workers have attempted to remove snow using shovels and plows. Steam rises from engines, curling and twisting into crystalline arcs that catch the gray light. The scene is chaotic, workers bundled against the cold, boots slipping, breath fogging the air, sweat mixing with powder. You imagine the strain of repeated exertion in sub-zero temperatures, muscles tightening, fingers stiffening, and morale tested as hours stretch into days. Historians still debate whether such interventions were effective in the long term or merely temporary solutions against relentless accumulation. Beyond this point, the tracks lead into small towns that have become effectively trapped. You notice isolated homes near the rails, smoke curling from chimneys in thin spirals, lantern light glowing faintly against the snow. Fringe tales recount travelers improvising shelter inside train cars when storms intensified unexpectedly, lining seats with hay, blankets, or newspaper to survive the night. You imagine stepping cautiously into one of these stranded cars, the muffled creak of metal against frost, the faint scent of coal smoke, and the quiet murmurs of fellow passengers bracing against winter's dominance. A freight train lies stalled, wheels spinning uselessly against ice-coated rails. You peer inside through frosted windows, glimpsing cargo boxes, crates of goods, and personal belongings haphazardly piled. Historians still argue whether railway schedules were rigid enough to prevent cascading delays, or whether each stranded train created a ripple of disruption, extending far beyond its immediate vicinity. Fringe anecdotes suggest that passengers sometimes used the trap time to play card games, carve small snow tunnels from windows to nearby drifts, or improvise heating with limited resources. You smile, imagining the blend of boredom, creativity, and human resilience that define these moments. Tracks stretch into a haze of snow, disappearing entirely into white. You trace them with your eyes, imagining other stranded trains further down the line, passengers wondering if and when relief would arrive. The wind carries faint whistles, muffled and distorted, each one a signal and a reminder of isolation. Fringe accounts describe workers and passengers communicating over short distances using flags, lanterns, or even banging tools against metal surfaces, creating ephemeral networks of contact in an otherwise silent landscape. You step lightly, mindful of the uneven terrain, aware that every ridge, drift, and hollow can hide danger. You encounter a small bridge, tracks partially buried, supporting beams stiff with ice. Snow swirls around the structure, sculpting drifts along its edges. You pause to take in the scene, imagining the difficulty of clearing the tracks, the risk of frostbite, and the sheer weight of accumulated snow. Historians still debate whether bridge design at the time adequately accounted for snow loads and freezing temperatures, or if temporary improvisation was the only realistic approach. Fringe stories suggest that some engineers poured heated water along rails to loosen ice, a precarious tactic that could temporarily aid movement while risking further damage. Beyond the bridge, you notice a line of utility poles partially buried in drifts. Snow clings to each one, forming sculpted icicles and bending wires toward the ground. The blizzard has rendered infrastructure fragile, delicate, yet imperious, bending human attempts at order into submission. Fringe accounts describe townspeople improvising to maintain essential communication by straining wires, creating temporary lines, or even sending messages manually along snow-covered tracks. You imagine a young messenger trudging along the rails, wind whipping powder into his eyes, boots heavy with slush, every step a testament to resilience. Night falls, softening edges and flattening perspective. The tracks stretch like invisible rivers through snow, guiding you toward distant towns, isolated farmhouses, and abandoned stations. Smoke rises intermittently, disappearing into the gray sky. Fringe stories note that in the cold, steam often froze mid-air, forming temporary crystalline patterns above locomotives and chimneys, a fleeting spectacle of geometric beauty, fragile against the relentless wind. You pause to admire these forms, tracing the spirals of frozen vapor, aware that their ephemeral nature mirrors the fleeting paths of humans navigating the storm. The temperature drops further. You press your scarf higher against your face, feeling snow melt briefly on your eyelashes before freezing again. Each step feels heavier, every breath sharper. Tracks are completely obscured in some sections, hidden beneath drifts taller than you. You trace the line with your gloved hand, feeling cold steel beneath the powder, a tactile reminder of human engineering persisting amid chaos. Historians still argue whether snow-clearing methods of the era could have realistically prevented large-scale isolation, or if the blizzard's speed and scale made the delays inevitable. You pause atop a small rise, looking down the tracks that vanish into white. Steam curls from a distant engine, barely visible through swirling powder, a lone reminder of life in the frozen expanse. You imagine the passengers inside, families, travelers, and workers, huddled together, improvising warmth, conserving energy, creating small communities within temporary vessels stranded in white. Fringe accounts describe passengers improvising snow corridors from windows to nearby drifts, connecting the interior to the outside world while maintaining safety and shelter. By midnight, the entire railway network seems suspended. Tracks, stations, and trains are partially obscured, softened by drifts, while isolated lanterns flicker like tiny beacons of human presence. You notice the faint sound of shovels against snow, distant voices, and muffled whistles carried and distorted by wind. The blizzard has asserted dominion, rendering mobility uncertain and transforming transportation into a delicate negotiation between human ingenuity and natural power. You breathe deeply, the cold tang of snow filling your lungs, feeling fatigue, exhilaration, and awe simultaneously. Each footfall is a small act of perseverance, a deliberate engagement with both the storm and the infrastructure designed to resist it. The blizzard has not merely halted trains, it has reshaped the very sense of distance, time, and human effort across the landscape. Smoke, steam, and snow swirl together in a hypnotic, disorienting dance that tests your perception and patience. You pause to watch a partially cleared switchyard. Wheels spin slowly, some futilely, ice grinding against steel. Fringe accounts describe passengers improvising shelters in empty freight cars, transforming frozen metal into temporary living quarters. Historians still debate whether centralized intervention could have prevented cascading delays, or if decentralized improvisation was the only practical response. You imagine moving cautiously among the cars, the crunch of snow beneath your boots and the faint hiss of steam forming a symphony of frozen persistence. As you continue along the tracks, you realize that the blizzard has erased boundaries between town, farm, and transportation corridor. Everything is unified in white, a single, expansive domain ruled by wind, snow, and temperature. Each footstep, each glance, each breath becomes a negotiation, an act of presence amid a transformed world. You are small, aware, and curiously alive in the midst of nature's indifferent authority. You move deeper into towns now almost entirely buried in snow. The streets you once knew are hidden beneath drifts so high they scrape the tops of windows. Each step feels like wading through clouds, boots disappearing almost completely, snow seeping into seams despite careful layering. The wind carries sharp crystals that sting your cheeks and swirl into your scarf, tasting metallic, almost electric. Historians still debate whether the sheer speed of accumulation in these areas could have been mitigated, or whether isolation was simply inevitable once the storm reached its peak. Homes appear as soft, white mounds. Rooflines sag slightly under relentless accumulation, chimneys barely visible as smoke rises, curling and twisting in the blizzard's grip. You imagine families huddled inside, warmth battling the cold pressing in from every side. Fringe accounts from similar storms report families digging corridors through snow to reach neighbors or supply caches, improvising tunnels that temporarily recreated the connectivity erased by relentless powder. You picture the dim glow of lanterns through these narrow snow corridors, shadows stretching across gloved hands and worried faces. Animals struggle in these transformed environments. You notice faint tracks of livestock that hint at cautious movement, sometimes forming small, improvised paths to food and shelter. Historians still argue whether livestock losses were primarily due to sudden snow accumulation or a lack of human foresight, while fringe stories celebrate cases where clever improvisation, like hay stacked along temporary snow tunnels, kept animals alive and moving. You imagine cows and sheep pressing through narrow passages, their breaths forming visible clouds, the sound muted under thick drifts. Wind gusts with increasing force, bending tree branches and piling powder into miniature walls across doorways and roads. You trudge forward, feeling every drift resist your movement, boots sinking deeper, muscles straining. Snow swirls around you, shifting constantly, and you are acutely aware that each step requires focus, energy, and awareness. Fringe accounts describe children building small snow forts outside homes during similar blizzards, tunnels and towers improvisational yet carefully engineered for fun and occasional survival assistance. You smile at the thought, imagining tiny architects working in powdery silence amid chaos. You approach a marketplace, once bustling, now a ghostly expanse of white. Stalls vanish beneath drifts, piles of goods half buried or fully covered, creating abstract shapes that could be mistaken for art if not for the urgency of survival pressing beneath. Historians still debate whether early urban planning considered rapid snowfall accumulation, or if reliance on daily routines left towns vulnerable to sudden winter extremes. Fringe accounts suggest merchants often improvised snow channels to maintain access to essential goods, digging narrow paths to produce or stores while snow continued to accumulate relentlessly around them. Smoke rises in delicate, curling streams from scattered chimneys, fragile signals of life in the white expanse. You notice distant figures moving carefully, navigating drifts with shovels or poles. Some carry supplies between houses, improvising routes that take hours rather than minutes. Fringe anecdotes describe temporary communal kitchens set up in partially cleared homes, where neighbors shared food and warmth, improvising recipes and resources to stretch supplies until the blizzard eased. You imagine the quiet camaraderie and creativity required to survive in these temporary micro-societies, where every act of sharing could be critical. Along the frozen streets, you see the remnants of transportation attempts. Horse-drawn sleds lie abandoned, half buried under drifts, harnesses stiff with ice. Faint hoofprints hint at routes taken before snow erased all traces. Historians still argue whether reliance on animal power could have realistically alleviated isolation, or whether the sheer scale of accumulation made all transport precarious at best. Fringe reports mention people improvising small sleds from crates, barrels, or even doors to move essential goods short distances, ingenuity driven by necessity. You imagine the careful navigation of these makeshift sleds, balancing speed with the risk of tipping into hidden ditches or drifts. You pass a schoolhouse, its roof creaking slightly under weight. Windows are frosted, but inside you imagine the faint warmth of stoves and the quiet presence of students and teachers improvising shelter. Fringe accounts describe schoolrooms sometimes repurposed as communal refuges during blizzards, with children helping to maintain fires, fetch food, and create makeshift pathways outside. Historians still debate whether such adaptive strategies were widespread or merely anecdotal, with varying success stories documented in different regions. In some courtyards, children's laughter echoes faintly, muffled by snow but persistent. They carve small tunnels between drifts, creating snow mazes, temporary forts, and miniature roads. You notice the ingenuity of these games doubling as survival exercises, teaching spatial awareness, cooperative problem solving, and tactile understanding of snow density. Fringe stories suggest that in certain historical blizzards, children helped adults monitor livestock or clear small snow corridors, their play becoming vital contributions to household survival. You trudge toward the town center, noticing faint tracks leading to the market, the church, and neighboring homes. Each path is temporary, quickly altered by wind, accumulation, and the sheer volume of powder. You watch a figure shoveling slowly, methodically, creating a narrow corridor to a neighboring house. The rhythm is almost hypnotic, punctuated by pauses to brush snow from the shovel or wipe frost from a scarf. Historians still debate whether these labor-intensive strategies were sustainable over multi-day storms, or if fatigue and freezing temperatures inevitably limited effectiveness. You notice faint smoke signals drifting across the rooftops. Fringe accounts report that early blizzards prompted townspeople to communicate using smoke, lanterns, or sound signals, creative improvisations to maintain connection when movement was impossible. You imagine the layered visual network of smoke columns, drifting in the wind, each representing a household, a safe passage, or an urgent need. In the midst of relentless snow, these ephemeral signals became lifelines, fragile threads linking isolated human presence across vast, frozen expanses. The wind intensifies, carrying powder into your eyes and making visibility a challenge. You adjust your scarf and hat, squinting to locate familiar landmarks obscured by drifts. Each step is careful, deliberate. The landscape has transformed entirely, yet subtle cues remain. You notice chimney smoke, faint fence lines, and the tops of buildings peeking through white. Fringe tales describe early storm survivors using such faint markers to orient themselves, relying on memory and ingenuity to traverse spaces that would otherwise seem infinite and disorienting. You reach a supply depot, half buried under drifts taller than a person. Barrels, crates, and sacks of food poke through the snow like forgotten treasures. You imagine townspeople braving the wind, digging corridors to retrieve essentials, conserving every calorie expended in the effort. Historians still argue whether early planning anticipated the need for such caches, or if their presence was incidental, the product of community improvisation rather than systemic foresight. Fringe anecdotes describe neighbors coordinating retrieval efforts, sometimes using pulleys or ropes to move heavy items along temporary snow channels, creativity compensating for the environment's unyielding hostility. A group of children appears near the depot, carrying small bundles, shuffling carefully through drifts. You watch as they navigate obstacles, their laughter muffled but persistent. Fringe accounts suggest that during historical blizzards, children often became couriers of necessity, transporting messages, small supplies, or even firewood along improvised paths, their energy vital to maintaining household functions. You notice the deliberate care with which they move, balancing playfulness with awareness, skill honed in repeated winter storms. By nightfall, the entire town is nearly unrecognizable. Streets, courtyards, and fields merge into undulating white, the familiar replaced by soft, sculpted drifts. Smoke rises in thin, twisting columns from scattered chimneys, lanterns glow faintly, and animals move cautiously, leaving temporary traces quickly erased by wind. You realize that even as the blizzard imposes isolation, the human spirit persists in subtle, ingenious, and collective ways. Historians still debate whether these adaptive strategies were universally effective or largely anecdotal, with survival often depending on quick thinking and local knowledge rather than formal planning. You pause atop a small rise, looking down the town now almost entirely obscured. Roofs peek through drifts, smoke rises intermittently, and faint traces of footprints hint at ongoing activity. Children's laughter, distant shoveling, and animal sounds punctuate the silence, creating a rhythm of human persistence amidst overwhelming natural forces. Fringe accounts note that in similar historical blizzards, temporary networks of corridors, tunnels, and visual signals allowed communities to maintain contact, ration resources, and protect vulnerable members even as snow continued to fall relentlessly. The wind whips higher, snow swirling in hypnotic arcs. You press your scarf closer, feeling the cold bite deeper into exposed skin. Each footstep is deliberate, every breath sharp, and yet there is a strange exhilaration in the rhythm of movement through the transformed town. You pause, aware that while the blizzard dominates, human ingenuity, temporary paths, communal shelters, improvised signaling, is quietly asserting itself, leaving subtle traces of resilience in a landscape that otherwise seems immutable. Night has deepened, folding over the town like a soft, suffocating blanket. You trudge along streets that have become unrecognizable, each step sinking into drifts taller than your knees, every gust of wind pushing against you like a physical hand. The buildings loom as half-formed silhouettes beneath layers of white. Rooftops are buried, chimneys just barely peeking through the powder. Smoke curls in hesitant spirals, bending immediately under the force of the blizzard, and the faint smell of wood fires drifts into your nostrils, sharp and comforting at once. Historians still debate whether townsfolk were psychologically prepared for the isolation that could stretch for days or even weeks during such storms, or if the monotony and relentless white expanse induced a creeping sense of despair. You pause at a crossroads, boots sinking into uneven drifts, wind tugging at your scarf. The usual markers, lampposts, signposts, curbs, are nearly invisible, flattened by snow or obscured in soft mounds. Fringe accounts from historical storms suggest that some residents used improvised markers, sticks, ropes, or even piles of snow to create temporary navigation aids for themselves and neighbors. You imagine these subtle beacons dotted across the town, the quiet effort of human ingenuity asserting itself against overwhelming forces, ephemeral yet vital in maintaining orientation. The silence is profound, broken only by occasional gusts or distant animal calls. You notice faint paw prints of cats and dogs, almost immediately covered by new snow, forming transient trails that hint at unseen movements. Fringe stories tell of animals guiding humans along hidden paths or alerting them to dangers buried under powder. You imagine a small dog appearing from a drifted alleyway, tail high, sniffing the air, and leading someone carefully along a safe route between houses. A silent partnership between species in the battle against isolation. A family emerges from a half-buried home, bundled and cautious, moving slowly toward a faintly cleared pathway. You follow at a distance, sensing both the fragility and determination in every step. Children laugh softly, muffled by scarves, but there is a tension in their movements, a shared awareness of danger. Historians still argue whether communal efforts to maintain basic routes were widespread or localized, dependent on family structures and neighborhood cooperation. Fringe accounts note that these efforts often required delicate coordination, where a misstep could collapse a tunnel, erase a path, or create a hidden hazard. The wind gusts harder, sculpting snow into miniature waves that shift with each breath of air. You pause to watch, noticing the delicate interplay of light and shadow across ridges and drifts. Every hillock, every hollow becomes an unpredictable terrain feature. You step carefully, aware of hidden ditches, partially buried debris, and ice lurking beneath soft powder. Fringe stories describe early blizzard survivors using tactile awareness to navigate, learning the density and resistance of snow in specific areas to avoid accidents, an almost instinctive literacy of frozen landscapes. You approach the town square, now buried beneath an undulating expanse of white. Statues, benches, and fountains disappear into drifts, leaving only abstract shapes. You imagine the square once bustling with vendors, children, and townsfolk, now silenced, a stage set entirely in white. Historians still debate whether towns had contingency plans for essential supplies in central locations, or whether the reliance on daily routines left them vulnerable to sudden, extreme snowfall. Fringe accounts report residents creating small snow channels to reach buried stores or communal caches, improvising connections that maintained access while minimizing exposure to wind and cold. A faint glimmer catches your eye, a lantern buried nearly to its base but still glowing faintly. You approach, brushing snow from its top, revealing a simple wooden post holding the light steady against the storm. Fringe stories describe such small beacons as critical markers for navigation, providing reassurance and guidance in environments that otherwise erase familiar visual cues. You imagine families using similar lanterns to guide each other between homes, a quiet choreography of survival maintained in the midst of relentless accumulation. Alongside partially buried fences, you notice small tunnels dug by children or neighbors. These narrow corridors allow for brief movement outside homes, connections between houses, and even small exchanges of food or messages. Historians still debate whether these improvisations were purely practical or also served as psychological relief, offering a sense of agency in environments where isolation could dominate. Fringe accounts suggest that children's play often doubled as necessary reconnaissance, testing snow stability, and maintaining critical connection while avoiding prolonged exposure. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys, forming delicate, twisting columns frozen momentarily by the cold. You watch as the wind scatters the smoke into delicate crystalline arcs, patterns that appear almost deliberate, like abstract art imposed upon the town. Fringe tales claim that observers once used smoke patterns to infer wind direction, depth of drifts, or even the location of partially buried paths, creating a subtle, empirical understanding of storm behavior in real time. You imagine standing amidst this ethereal display, sensing the interplay of human ingenuity and natural authority in every movement of powder and vapor. A dog barks faintly in the distance, tail raised, moving cautiously along a partially cleared path. You follow its direction, recognizing the small role animals play in signaling the presence of pathways, homes, or other humans. Fringe accounts report early survivors relying on animals to locate hidden caches, track other residents, or detect hazards buried under snow. You imagine a brief partnership, boots crunching lightly, dog leading confidently, wind tugging at scarves and coats, creating a rhythm of cautious navigation in isolation. You reach a small church, the steeple barely visible through swirling snow. Inside, faint candlelight glows through frosted windows. Fringe stories describe churches as temporary refuges during storms, places where communities gathered to maintain warmth, share food, and offer moral support. Historians still debate whether reliance on religious institutions was primarily symbolic or truly functional, but accounts consistently note that these buildings provided psychological as well as practical respite. You imagine families gathering quietly, voices low, sharing stories and conserving heat, the blizzard's roar softened by stone walls and human ingenuity. Nearby homes have smoke rising in thin spirals, almost artistic in their transient forms. You notice the effort it takes to maintain fires amid constant snow intrusion, the delicate balancing act between warmth, fuel conservation, and safety. Fringe accounts suggest that survivors built temporary snow walls to protect chimneys from drift intrusion, or dug shallow channels to divert accumulation away from doors and windows. You imagine the quiet labor required, a subtle negotiation between human ingenuity and nature's unyielding authority. The streets themselves are unrecognizable, drifts softening edges, erasing curbs, and flattening familiar routes. You move cautiously, aware that each step requires assessment, anticipating hidden hazards beneath powder. Fringe stories report that communities improvised tactile and visual cues to maintain orientation, from sticks and ropes to snow markings and small lanterns, a temporary system of guidance and reassurance. Historians still argue whether such methods were universally effective or dependent on the individual skills, patience, and knowledge of local residents. By nightfall, the town feels suspended in time, isolated and softened by relentless accumulation. Every house, street, and field has been transformed, yet life persists. Smoke rises, lanterns glow, children move carefully, and animals navigate instinctively. The blizzard dominates the environment, yet subtle human and animal activity persists, a quiet testament to resilience and ingenuity. Fringe accounts describe these small acts, digging tunnels, maintaining fires, improvising communication, as essential ephemeral strategies that kept communities connected and functional despite overwhelming isolation. You pause atop a small rise, gazing down at the snow-covered town. Roofs peek through drifts, smoke rises intermittently, and faint tracks suggest ongoing activity. The wind swirls around you, carrying powder into eyes and clothing, yet you feel a strange exhilaration, a sense of being alive in the midst of both challenge and beauty. Historians still debate the extent to which isolation affected community morale, but fringe accounts highlight small rituals, shared humor, and ingenuity as critical factors in maintaining resilience. The blizzard continues unabated, sculpting every surface, softening every edge, erasing boundaries between streets, houses, and fields. You trudge forward, boots heavy, scarf tight, breath sharp, every movement deliberate. Even as snow accumulates relentlessly, subtle signals of life persist: smoke, footprints, faint lantern glow, the careful movement of animals, marking human presence and quiet ingenuity against a transformed world. You are aware that this is the crescendo of isolation, the point at which human endurance, improvisation, and community spirit are tested against relentless winter authority. You leave the town behind, venturing into the open countryside, where farms lie almost entirely swallowed by snow. Fields are unrecognizable, transformed into undulating white expanses that stretch to the horizon. Fences, once clear boundaries, are softened into abstract ridges. Barns peek through drifts like islands in a frozen sea. The wind scours the landscape, carrying powder into your face and forcing every step to be deliberate. Historians still debate whether early agricultural communities anticipated the sheer scale of accumulation that could bury entire farms in days, or if much of their survival relied on rapid improvisation. You approach a farmhouse partially obscured by a drift taller than your head. Smoke curls from a chimney in thin, twisting spirals, the only indication that life persists inside. Fringe accounts describe families digging narrow tunnels from doorways to nearby outbuildings, creating temporary passageways to maintain access to livestock and supplies. You imagine the painstaking labor required, every shovel full of snow a negotiation between necessity and exhaustion, the blizzard dictating tempo and strategy. Cattle, horses, and sheep move cautiously through narrow corridors carved between drifts. You notice the faint crunch of hooves on packed snow, the small plumes of breath rising from animals as they navigate the temporary tunnels. Historians still argue whether livestock losses were due to direct exposure to snow and wind or secondary factors such as delayed feeding and inadequate shelter. Fringe accounts tell of inventive measures, like stacking hay to create elevated feeding platforms or constructing snow walls to shield animals from wind, demonstrating creativity born of desperation. You trudge past a half-buried barn, its roof groaning under weight, walls frosted, and doors partially jammed by drifts. Inside, you imagine hay piled high, animals huddled together, and families improvising small stoves or lanterns to provide warmth. Fringe stories describe barn interiors converted into temporary living spaces during blizzards, with humans and animals coexisting in tight quarters, conserving heat and resources while maintaining vigilance against collapse or suffocation. You visualize the faint glow of lanterns, shadows dancing across frosted beams, and the quiet tension of survival coexisting with curiosity and humor. The fields surrounding the farmhouse are transformed into snow plains, subtle undulations hiding irrigation ditches, fences, and pathways. You step carefully, probing with a walking stick, aware that beneath soft powder could lie hidden hazards: ice, frozen mud, or drifted equipment. Fringe tales recount farmers navigating the white wilderness by memory and touch, learning the density of snow, the firmness of frozen earth, and the subtle shifts of terrain that mark familiar boundaries in extraordinary conditions. Historians still debate whether such expertise was widespread or dependent on generational knowledge and local experience. A tractor, abandoned mid-field, is nearly buried. Its wheels stick out awkwardly, coated in frost, and tracks leading to it are shallow at best. You imagine the futility of moving machinery under such conditions. Any effort to free it would require labor, heat, and ingenuity. Fringe accounts describe neighbors collaborating to improvise levers, ropes, or makeshift sleds to reposition equipment, each act a small victory over winter's dominance. The scene has a quiet absurdity. Machines meant to enhance productivity rendered temporarily useless by elemental insistence. You follow faint trails of livestock, pressed cautiously through narrow snow corridors between fences and drifts. Sheep move in hesitant clusters, lowing softly, while cows nudge gently against the snow walls, seeking stability. Horses paw at compacted snow, nostrils flaring, occasionally stamping to break through icy patches. Historians still debate the degree to which farmers could realistically maintain full feeding schedules during deep blizzards, or whether survival relied on ad hoc improvisation and ingenuity under duress. Fringe accounts suggest that animal behavior often guided human activity, signaling safe paths, weak snow bridges, or areas where drift accumulation threatened collapse. You approach an orchard, trees laden with snow and ice. Branches bend heavily, sometimes snapping under the weight. A few birds perch tentatively, fluffed against the cold, calling softly. Fringe reports describe how early observers noted wildlife adapting subtly, birds huddling in dense trees, squirrels navigating snow tunnels, and farm cats maintaining small territories around barns and homes. You imagine the quiet coexistence of humans and animals, each improvising to survive, each learning subtly from the other. Near a partially buried silo, you notice the effort to preserve grain and fodder. Snow drifts press against walls, threatening to seal entrances, while icicles form along eaves and ledges. Inside, you imagine barrels and sacks stacked carefully, families using improvised funnels or channels to maintain access despite encroaching snow. Historians still debate whether stockpiling practices in rural communities were sufficient for extraordinary storms, or if survival often hinged on temporary improvisations guided by necessity and local knowledge. Fringe accounts detail the creative solutions employed, including ropes, pulleys, and narrow snow channels to move supplies safely from storage to animals. A wind gust nearly knocks you off balance, snow blinding your vision for a moment. You pause, adjusting your scarf, noticing subtle ridges in the landscape that hint at buried fences, shallow ditches, or hidden irrigation channels. Fringe stories recount early farmers learning to read snow like a map, interpreting drift patterns, density, and wind direction to navigate safely and locate essential points in their property. You marvel at this tacit knowledge, built over generations, transformed into practical wisdom under extreme conditions. You reach a small chicken coop, snow piled high against the sides. You imagine hens scratching cautiously in narrow patches of exposed ground, muffled clucking as they navigate the powder. Fringe accounts describe families creating temporary enclosures, using boards or crates to shield birds from the wind while allowing minimal movement for feeding and egg-laying. Historians still argue whether such measures were generally effective or largely anecdotal, but repeated observations highlight human ingenuity in adapting to sudden isolation. You trudge toward a frozen pond, where the surface is slick with ice, dusted with fresh snow. Livestock move cautiously near the edges, testing footing, while children in some accounts from historical storms used such frozen water bodies for cautious play or resource management. Fringe stories note that ponds sometimes served as temporary sources of water, where ice was carefully broken to maintain minimal access for animals and humans alike, highlighting adaptive problem solving amid extreme weather. Along narrow farm tracks, you notice traces of previous efforts, small cleared paths, partially buried tools, and footprints indicating human and animal movement. Every trace is transient, subject to immediate erasure by wind and accumulation. Fringe tales describe the subtle choreography required to maintain these micro-paths, a constant negotiation of energy, resources, and attention against the blizzard's relentless creativity. Historians still debate whether survival was more dependent on communal coordination or individual persistence in these peripheral areas. You approach a farmhouse where smoke rises consistently, the faint light of a lantern glowing through a snow-laden window. Inside, families improvise warmth, using stoves, hay, and blankets, balancing heat, fuel, and the necessity of minimal exposure to the cold outside. Fringe accounts describe early blizzards prompting collaborative cooking and resource sharing, emphasizing not only survival, but also the subtle maintenance of morale and normalcy amid relentless isolation. You imagine the quiet conversation, laughter, and occasional humor, small human rituals sustaining life against the blizzard's authority. By nightfall, the countryside is an expansive, undulating white. Every barn, field, and farmhouse is softened, merged, or obscured entirely. Smoke, footprints, and faint lantern light offer fragile indications of life. Animals move cautiously through improvised corridors, children play in subtle tunnels, and adults maintain vital supplies. Historians still debate the limits of agricultural resilience in extraordinary blizzards, while fringe accounts celebrate the improvisational genius of rural communities in maintaining life, structure, and hope under the weight of snow and wind. You pause atop a drift, surveying the transformed landscape. Fields stretch like frozen oceans, barns peak intermittently, livestock move cautiously, and faint traces of human ingenuity form an invisible network of resilience. The wind sculpts snow around you, creating soft ridges, valleys, and abstract forms. You breathe deeply, tasting the metallic tang of snow, feeling the cold penetrate layers, yet sensing the quiet life persisting in both humans and animals, a testament to ingenuity, endurance, and subtle adaptation in a world temporarily dominated by winter's authority. The snow stretches endlessly as you move between farms and towns, a blank canvas on which the blizzard sculpts both beauty and threat. Each step is deliberate, boots sinking deep, snow creeping into seams despite careful layering. The wind scours your face, cold and metallic, whispering over the drifts like an invisible, omnipresent force. You notice smoke curling faintly from chimneys, the thin trails of human presence reminding you that life persists even under extraordinary conditions. Historians still debate whether communities could have realistically anticipated the rapid depletion of food and firewood during such storms, or if improvisation was the primary survival tool. You come across a partially buried supply shed, its roof sagging under the snow. You brush snow aside and imagine barrels, crates, and sacks carefully stored inside. Fringe accounts suggest early survivors often rationed meticulously, sometimes dividing flour, grain, or canned goods into daily portions, creating a fragile balance between sustenance and the blizzard's relentless challenge. You imagine the precision required, every hand movement measured, every decision deliberate, as families calculate how long supplies might last under isolation. The wind intensifies, sculpting drifts into waves and ridges that obscure familiar landmarks. You follow faint footprints, some human, some animal, carefully navigating toward barns, fences, or neighboring homes. Fringe tales describe communities improvising snow corridors connecting structures, allowing minimal movement without exposing themselves unnecessarily. You picture the delicate choreography, small paths dug, reinforced by boards, ropes, or snow walls, each one an ephemeral bridge between human activity and the blizzard's constant reshaping of the environment. Animals continue to play subtle, critical roles in this frozen network. Cattle nudge snow aside to reach hay, sheep cluster cautiously in narrow corridors, and dogs guide humans along temporarily cleared paths. Historians still debate the extent to which animal behavior influenced survival strategies versus human ingenuity alone, but fringe accounts consistently highlight the subtle partnership between species. You watch a dog pause, sniff the wind, and lead a figure toward a faint lantern glow, an act of instinct blending with survival necessity. You reach a farmhouse whose door is partially blocked by a drift. Snow walls rise on either side, curling into ridges shaped by wind and gravity. Inside, families improvise warmth with small stoves and layered blankets. Fringe stories recount residents melting snow for drinking water, layering hay and clothing for insulation, and using small stoves in temporary corridors to sustain both humans and livestock. Historians still argue whether early architectural designs adequately accounted for extraordinary snow loads, or if these adaptations were largely reactive, born from necessity rather than planning. Nearby fields are marked only by faint undulations, hinting at buried fences, ditches, and irrigation channels. You step carefully, aware that the snow conceals hazards, and imagine the subtle tactile awareness developed by those who navigated these landscapes daily. Fringe accounts describe early farmers reading snow for stability, density, and hidden obstacles, transforming sensory observation into a practical map in real time. You appreciate the quiet intelligence required to survive in such a continuously shifting environment. The wind picks up, carrying powder into your eyes, biting at any exposed skin. Smoke from chimneys twists and folds, frozen temporarily into crystalline arcs by the cold. You imagine families watching the smoke carefully, interpreting wind direction, drift depth, and snow accumulation as vital cues in planning movement and resource management. Fringe stories describe subtle improvisations, lanterns, small markers, ropes along buried fences, to maintain orientation, prevent disorientation, and create temporary networks of connectivity. Historians still debate whether these methods were widespread or primarily localized to more experienced households. You navigate toward a partially cleared barn. Animals press close, their breaths forming clouds of vapor that blend into the gray sky. Hay has been carefully stacked, pathways shoveled, and temporary barriers constructed to protect livestock from wind and drift. Fringe accounts suggest that some barns were equipped with snow channels to facilitate movement of feed, water, or emergency supplies, demonstrating an extraordinary mix of improvisation, experience, and urgency. You imagine a farmer moving slowly through the corridors, each action deliberate, balancing speed with caution to avoid accidents in confined, snow-laden spaces. A small group of children appears near a snow-covered orchard, carrying minor supplies and moving carefully along narrow paths. Their laughter is muffled by scarves, but the cadence is persistent, almost defiant. Fringe tales describe children serving as messengers, maintaining small links between homes or supply points, and helping monitor livestock, tasks blending play, observation, and necessity. Historians still argue whether child involvement was primarily beneficial or a reflection of desperate circumstances, but the accounts consistently highlight ingenuity and adaptability. You pause near a frozen creek. Water flows beneath a fragile ice layer, creating subtle patterns and textures under snow dust. Animals test footing cautiously, and you imagine residents carefully breaking small portions of ice for drinking water or livestock. Fringe stories suggest creative solutions, such as temporarily shoring up edges with boards or using snow channels to control flow, demonstrating ingenuity under environmental constraint. Historians still debate whether these improvisations could realistically maintain water access over multi-day storms without significant effort and risk. Smoke continues to curl from chimneys in delicate spirals, bent and twisted by wind, while lanterns glow faintly through snow-laden windows. You imagine families strategizing internally, rationing food, conserving heat, and maintaining morale amid relentless accumulation. Fringe accounts describe temporary kitchens or communal stoves established in partially cleared spaces, allowing residents to share warmth, cooking, and conversation, a subtle critical mechanism for sustaining social cohesion and psychological resilience. The wind pushes snow into miniature tunnels and arches, sculpting the environment in constant motion. You step carefully, boots sinking and crunching, aware of hidden ice and compacted drifts. Fringe tales highlight the tactile literacy developed in these conditions, where observing resistance, density, and sound in snow could mean the difference between safe passage and accident. Historians still argue whether such knowledge was broadly disseminated or dependent on individual observation, training, and generational wisdom. You pass a small storage shed, its door jammed with snow. Inside, barrels, crates, and sacks of food are partially visible. Fringe accounts suggest residents maintained careful inventory systems during blizzards, dividing supplies into daily rations and redistributing based on immediate needs. You imagine the careful deliberation in every movement, balancing caloric expenditure with caloric intake, ensuring each family member, human and animal, survives the storm. Historians still debate the overall efficiency of these strategies, but anecdotal evidence consistently underscores the ingenuity of adaptive rationing and improvisation. Night falls, softening edges, blending drifts, and obscuring landmarks. Smoke, lanterns, and faint footprints are the only indicators of human presence. You pause, listening to the subtle symphony of winter, wind howling across fields, the muffled movement of animals, occasional shovels scraping against snow. Fringe stories describe this auditory awareness as essential, guiding residents between essential locations when visual cues were nearly erased. Historians still debate whether the reliance on sound and tactile cues was systematically taught or simply a matter of practical necessity learned through experience. You trudge toward a partially cleared path connecting multiple farmhouses. The corridor is narrow, walls of snow rising on either side, guiding your movement. Animals follow, humans navigate cautiously, and children occasionally dart ahead, small lights or glimpses of color momentarily bright against white. Fringe accounts describe these corridors as both practical and psychological, providing pathways of safety and social connection while reinforcing morale. You sense the delicate interplay between improvisation, environmental awareness, and human cooperation, a dynamic repeated across countless storm-affected regions. By midnight, the countryside feels suspended in time, a vast expanse of white, punctuated only by smoke, lanterns, footprints, and movement through snow corridors. Life persists quietly but insistently, humans and animals navigating improvisations, rationing supplies, maintaining warmth, and creating ephemeral networks of survival. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these strategies, yet fringe accounts consistently emphasize ingenuity, adaptability, and community as vital forces resisting the blizzard's relentless authority. You pause atop a drift, surveying the landscape. Fields merge into soft ridges, barns peak intermittently, livestock move cautiously, and faint trails hint at human activity. The wind sculpts the snow ceaselessly, creating ephemeral forms that are beautiful, dangerous, and ever-changing. You breathe deeply, tasting the cold metallic air, feeling fatigue and exhilaration intertwined. In this frozen expanse, life persists, fragile yet resilient, guided by improvisation, subtle observation, and the quiet persistence of humans and animals alike, small victories in a vast, white wilderness. Isolation settles over the landscape like a second storm, quieter but no less formidable. As you push deeper into the countryside, communication lines vanish beneath drifts that rise like frozen dunes, burying fence posts, sheds, and eventually entire first floors. The world feels muffled, soundproofed by snow, every distant noise softened until even the wind seems to whisper rather than howl. You sense how vulnerable communities become when voices cannot carry, when signals fail, and when the familiar means of reaching out dissolve into white silence. Historians still debate whether the sudden breakdown in communication was inevitable, or if more could have been done. Pre-storm agreements, better signals, more robust lines. But fringe accounts insist the blizzard's pace allowed little time for anything more than survival. You pass a house almost indistinguishable from the landscape. Only the chimney and a faint window glow betray its presence. Families inside rely on improvised systems to communicate with neighbors. Lantern flashes from attics, smoke signals shaped with damp cloths, and rhythmic knocking on buried walls shared between households only a few feet apart. Fringe stories describe this last method vividly, tapping patterns on shared barn walls or snow-packed corridors, like Morse code born not from telegraph wires but from necessity. You imagine gloved knuckles rapping on timber. Are you safe? Do you need wood? Are the animals fed? These improvised codes form temporary lifelines amid the blizzard's swallowing quiet. Historians still argue whether such tapping networks were widespread or merely folklore stemming from a few remote clusters that had particularly close farms. You continue along a faint path, its edges marked by half-buried boards poking up like ribs. This was once a well-used lane connecting several families, now a narrow trench carved by shovels and persistence. Walls rise high on both sides, sculpted by wind and human hands into a long corridor through which figures move slowly, shoulders brushing snow. Fringe accounts call these winter tunnels, temporary arteries of communication and supply. You imagine a mother sending her child along this corridor with a small bucket of embers or a pot of broth for a neighbor, the glowing lantern bobbing behind them like a lone star in the dim trench. Historians remain unsure whether these tunnels were intentional pre-storm strategies or spontaneous responses, adapted hour by hour as drifts grew. Farther along, you encounter a telegraph pole lying deeply embedded in the snow, pulled down by ice and wind. The cable disappears beneath a drift, rendering long-distance messages impossible. Residents resort to physical messengers, usually the most snow-wise members of a household, often adolescents or experienced farmers, tasked with navigating the blinding white to deliver vital news. Fringe tales praise these couriers as unsung heroes. You imagine one trudging through the storm, leaning into gusts, guided only by memory, the faint outline of trees, and instinctual knowledge of the land's texture underfoot. Historians still debate whether such travel was feasible under peak conditions, or if fringe reports embellish the frequency of these crossings. At a small homestead, smoke pours steadily from a narrow chimney extension built hastily to rise above the drifts. Families inside take turns clearing vents, knocking snow away from windows, and adjusting makeshift flues to maintain airflow. Without communication, each household becomes its own tiny world, forced to improvise solutions with limited resources. Fringe accounts describe families placing candles in upper windows as signals, steady for "we're fine," flickering for "we need assistance," and extinguished entirely for "come quickly." You imagine peering across the white expanse, searching for small flames that speak louder than voices could through the wind. Historians argue over the reliability of candle signals in such conditions. Still, the stories persist, passed down by families who claim the system saved lives. You move toward a cluster of barns, each partially buried, their roofs bowed under the weight. Here, animals are both responsibility and resource, demanding constant monitoring. Residents mount small mirrors or shards of polished tin on sticks above snow level, catching glints of light to signal neighboring barns or homes. Fringe tales say these flashes served as rudimentary heliographs, simple yet ingenious. You picture a farmer raising a scrap of metal through a narrow vent, angling it toward a distant house, hoping the brief shimmer communicates need, safety, or urgency. Historians still debate whether such reflective techniques were intentional or merely opportunistic gestures that later evolved into legend. You come upon a remote household, almost swallowed by drifts. A rope line stretches from the door to a nearby shed, the only guide through the shifting snow. Inside, the family maintains a communication shelf by the entrance, notes scratched on scraps of wood or cloth left for any traveler who might pass. The messages range from practical, left hay in the barn tunnel, to desperate, snow collapsed the east wall, need help tonight. Fringe accounts suggest entire communities built communal message boards at intersections of snow tunnels, turning buried crossroads into hubs of silent correspondence. Historians question whether enough movement occurred to justify such systems during peak storm days, but the notion underscores human determination to remain connected. You continue, noticing how the blizzard has blurred boundaries, fences hidden, lanes erased, property lines meaningless. In this new landscape, communication becomes universal rather than territorial. You come across a makeshift mast fashioned from a sapling, a cloth tied at the top. The cloth flaps weakly in the wind, a signal meant for anyone familiar with the family's prearranged code. Fringe stories say that colors, shapes, and even knots in fabric conveyed specific meanings. You imagine families tying strips of colored cloth, blue for water shortages, red for injury, green for food scarcity. Historians view these accounts skeptically, citing a lack of physical evidence, but oral traditions insist such flags dotted the countryside. As you travel, you sense increasing desperation in the subtle signs left behind by isolated households. A half-dug tunnel abandoned mid-path, a fallen lantern buried in snow, a series of frantic footprints leading to a barn and stopping abruptly where drifts swallowed them. Communication, once a matter of convenience, becomes a life-and-death necessity. Fringe tales describe residents banging pots outside narrow vents to draw attention, their metallic echoes bouncing strangely across packed snow. You imagine a single rhythmic clang traveling farther than a voice ever could in such muffled air. Historians still argue whether these acoustic methods worked meaningfully, but the narrative persists, metal, sound, and perseverance forging connection. At the next farmhouse, the family has crafted signal boards, simple panels placed near the attic window, each painted with a symbol. A circle for all safe, a cross for come, a triangle for low supplies. These boards resemble early maritime or military signals adapted spontaneously for landlocked blizzard survival. Fringe accounts describe startling uniformity in these symbols across different regions, suggesting either shared memory or parallel improvisation. Historians question whether such standardization could develop spontaneously under crisis, but families who survive these storms stand by the story with quiet certainty. You cross a frozen field where communication between households ceased days ago. Snow lies untouched, no recent footsteps, no tunnel entrances, no glints of tin or candlelight. In such silent places, a subtle dread lingers. What happened inside these isolated homes? Fringe tales describe families trapped by drifts so high they could not exit, relying entirely on rooftop vents for air. Communication here becomes spiritual or symbolic, placing items near vents as signs. A glove for warmth needed, a scarf for illness, a boot for help required. Historians find little documentation to support these symbolic signals. Still, The emotional weight of such imagery persists in oral history. As you continue, you reach a farmhouse showing signs of struggle. The door is cracked from pressure, windows reinforced with whatever materials the residents could find, boards, furniture, even light pieces of metal. A faint tapping sounds from beneath the snow, the steady rhythm unmistakably intentional. You press your ear to a drift near the wall and recognize the pattern, a form of local code, a sequence passed between families during winter seasons for generations. Fringe accounts romanticize these tapping languages, painting them as secretive, almost mystical. Historians acknowledge the possibility but caution against over-interpretation. Still, the tapping continues, a testament that someone inside persists, communicates, survives. Nearby, you find a makeshift periscope constructed from pipes and small mirrors, rising like a strange creature from the snow. Families inside use it to scan for movement, lanterns, or any sign of neighbors. Fringe tales describe these snow periscopes as clever inventions allowing households to remain aware of the outside world without digging through dangerous drifts. You imagine someone adjusting it from inside, breath fogging the interior glass, scanning for hope in the windswept white. Historians argue whether such contraptions were common or merely exceptional cases of ingenuity, but the image illustrates a timeless truth. Humans innovate in adversity. As night falls again, the world dims to shades of blue and indigo. Lanterns glow faintly in a few windows, most remain dark. You picture families rationing not only food and firewood but also light, each flame a precious resource. Communication becomes a choreography of shadows. Fringe stories describe families arranging silhouettes near windows to signal presence, comfort, or danger. A figure standing still for long moments meant, "We're here." Two figures meant, "We're safe." A rapidly moving shadow meant urgent. Historians remain skeptical, yet accounts echo across multiple surviving narratives. You continue through the snow corridors, passing signs of inventive survival. Vents fashioned from stovepipes to prevent suffocation, rope networks mapping invisible paths, cloth-wrapped sticks marking the way like silent sentinels. Communication, though improvised, expands into a rich language of movement, sound, light, and creativity. You sense how isolation forces communities to adapt, turning ordinary objects into conduits of meaning. By dawn, the storm has calmed slightly, revealing subtle evidence of these overlapping fragile networks. Lantern glass half buried, scrap wood scribbled with messages, rope lines leading toward still surviving households. Isolation remains, but communication, however faint, persists. The blizzard tests not only structures and supplies, but the ability of humans to remain connected, to reach for one another when the world grows silent and white. Historians continue to debate the factual accuracy of many such accounts, but fringe stories insist it was this improvisational web of signals, sounds, and small acts of ingenuity that allowed remote households to endure. You pause, taking in the frozen landscape, sensing both its beauty and indifference. Here, survival depends not only on warmth or food, but on the fragile bridges built between isolated lives, bridges of light, sound, gesture, and will. And in the quiet after the storm's roar, you recognize that communication, even in the slightest form, becomes the heartbeat of survival. Night settles over the snowbound world like a slow-moving veil, its edges soft, its weight immense. You can feel it even before true darkness arrives. The air thickens, the landscape dims, and every distant contour dissolves into a single, uninterrupted sheet of white. This is the hour when the psychological strain curls its fingers around even the steadiest minds. Inside snow-sealed homes, time warps, stretches, folds in on itself. You sense it instantly. The way minutes feel like hours, the way silence becomes a sound of its own. Historians still argue whether the greatest danger of the blizzard was the cold or the isolation that gnawed at people from the inside out. You make your way toward a farmhouse barely visible beneath a drift that rises almost to the eaves. A faint glow leaks from a small rooftop vent, the only place not smothered by snow. Inside, the family likely huddles close, rationing firewood, breath, and hope. Fringe accounts describe how some households experienced snow time, an altered sense of reality where days blurred, meals blended together, and sleep became unpredictable. You can almost feel it yourself, the strange, floating awareness that comes from too much quiet and too few cues from the outside world. As you circle the house, wind brushes icy grains against your coat, soft as sand but sharp on the skin. The sound is constant, a whispering hiss, like countless tiny fingers tapping on every surface. You understand why frontier families often spoke of hearing voices in the wind, or distant knocks that seemed too patterned to be random. Fringe stories claim people occasionally mistook shifting frost for whispered warnings or encouragements. Historians disagree about the extent of such auditory hallucinations, but medical researchers note that sensory deprivation combined with fear can play unusual tricks on the mind. You pass a narrow cut in the snow leading to a barn, probably carved days ago and now half collapsed. The air inside the trench feels colder, thinner. You imagine a child being asked to walk this path in the dark, clutching a lantern flickering weakly, the flames shivering as violently as their hands. The idea makes your breath wobble. Even adults confess to feeling unnerved by nighttime trips through snow tunnels. One quirky anecdote recalls a man who swore he saw the shadow of a horse above him, when in reality it was just his own lantern light bouncing off a ridge. You think of how vulnerable human perception becomes when the world shrinks to white walls and narrow passages. A crack echoes somewhere behind you, startling you into stillness. Snow settles, ice shifts. But in the dark, every ordinary sound feels extraordinary, magnified by isolation. Residents trapped in deep drifts often compared nighttime storms to being buried alive. Yet they also described moments of unexpected comfort, the soft groan of settling timbers reminding them the house was holding strong, or the rhythmic breathing of livestock in a nearby shed offering reassurance. Historians still debate whether livestock genuinely calmed people or if this is a romanticized memory passed down through generations. You approach another home, this one completely swallowed except for a small tunnel leading to the second-floor window. The entrance is reinforced with boards to prevent collapse. You crawl closer and listen. A faint hum carries through the wood, voices inside, speaking softly, perhaps to avoid using too much oxygen. Families often whispered during the worst nights, convinced that loud speech would somehow attract danger or disturb fragile structures. Fringe accounts insist some households created ritualized nighttime routines to cope, reciting stories, humming songs, or marking time by passing a small stone from person to person. You imagine how grounding that would feel, something tangible to hold on to when the world outside is too cold and too vast. A dog barks faintly, muffled by layers of snow. Dogs played a peculiar psychological role during these storms. Their restlessness warned residents of subtle structural shifts, and their calm indicated relative safety. One quirky tidbit claims that a particularly famous sheepdog became a community alarm system, recognizable by its sequence of barks that signaled whether someone was approaching or whether snow had collapsed a nearby shed. You smile at the thought, how even in chaos, animals often understand the environment better than humans. The temperature drops as full night takes hold. Your breath forms clouds that linger unnaturally long, drifting like small ghosts before fading. You feel the profound stillness of this hour, and you understand why people wrote later about how nights inside snow-sealed homes felt endless. Without moonlight, without stars, without warmth except for dwindling fires, Families often sat awake listening to their own heartbeat. Historians still argue whether insomnia was more common due to fear or due to the constant creaking of wood under snow weight. Probably both. You continue along a ridge and spot an attic window glowing faintly. The glass is etched with frost patterns, intricate, swirling shapes that look almost like runes. You recall a fringe story about parents calming children by interpreting frost shapes as snow letters sent by their ancestors. It's whimsical, maybe even fabricated, but you can picture it. A sleepy child pressing their nose to the frozen pane, tracing shapes with one mittened finger while a parent whispers soothing nonsense. In a storm like this, comfort outweighs accuracy every time. A faint rhythmic tapping echoes from another home. You recognize it instantly from earlier sections, neighbors signaling their presence or condition. In the dark, this tapping becomes strangely intimate, almost like hearing someone breathe from miles away. You move closer and hear the faint return taps, a slow, steady beat. It reassures you, and you feel a quiet warmth rise in your chest. Humans reach for each other even when they cannot see one another's faces. Historians still debate how widespread these tapping codes were, but the emotional resonance of the practice is undeniable. You enter a shallow snow corridor between two properties. The walls loom overhead, carved smooth by passing bodies and candle heat. Lanterns hang at intervals, dim flames placed in alcoves to guide night travelers. Their light dances unpredictably, turning the corridor into a flickering dreamscape. You walk slowly, feeling the pull of drowsiness that comes naturally with the low light and rhythmic wind. Fringe accounts describe snow days, a lethargy that swept over people during prolonged isolation, making them dangerously calm even during emergencies. Scientists today might call it mild hypoxia combined with psychological exhaustion, but frontier families viewed it as winter's way of hypnotizing the unwary. A soft moan of wind sweeps over the corridor's top, making it sound almost like singing. Stories from the era describe families believing the storm had voices, comforting or threatening depending on mood. One quirky anecdote recounts a grandmother insisting the wind was telling her to put more potatoes in the pot. You chuckle, imagining the family rolling their eyes but doing it anyway. In isolation, even humor becomes a survival tool. A single joke can lift an entire room's spirits for hours. You emerge into a clearing, really just a depression where the wind has carved away the top layers of snow. In the center stands an improvised snow cairn topped with a lantern. These cairns served as psychological anchors, marking safe territory or indicating paths between households. Fringe enthusiasts argue they also acted as emotional beacons, helping people fight despair. You walk around the cairn, noticing small objects tucked into its sides, buttons, scraps of ribbon, even a carved wooden toy. Offerings, maybe, or reminders that people were still out there, still contributing to the shared symbol of survival. Historians still debate whether these cairns were communal creations or spontaneous acts of individual families. The night deepens. You sense how weary the landscape has become, a quiet, aching kind of fatigue spreading across frozen fields. You imagine the households inside their snow cocoons, some resting fitfully, some awake and listening, some moving quietly to keep blood flowing. Frontier journals describe how people tried to maintain routines, even simple ones, boiling water at a certain hour, checking vents regularly, telling stories before bed. These rituals offered structure when the outside world had none. You recall one particularly striking historical fact. During the most infamous blizzards of the late 19th century, timekeeping became nearly impossible for isolated families. Clocks froze. Candles burned irregularly. Night and day passed in indistinguishable cycles of gray. Some households later discovered they had been awake for nearly 30 hours without realizing it, or that they'd slept through half a day thinking it was only a short nap. Historians still debate how accurate these accounts are, but the psychological impact feels entirely believable. As you continue through the silent night, you understand one thing deeply. The blizzard tests the mind as fiercely as it tests the body. The cold may threaten flesh, but the quiet threatens reason. Isolation doesn't scream, it whispers. It sneaks its way into thoughts, softens judgment, magnifies fears. Yet it also enhances small beauties. The glow of a single candle, the warmth of shared blankets, the sound of a neighbor's reassuring tap, the familiar scent of simmering broth. You pause and look around. Snow glitters faintly under the dim light of a hidden moon. The world feels both enormous and impossibly small. You are a single figure in a universe of white, yet you feel the presence of every household around you, breathing, waiting, enduring. The storm has created thousands of tiny islands, each home a world unto itself. But as you stand there, wrapped in the hush of the blizzard's night, you realize those worlds are not truly alone. They are connected by tunnels, taps, lanterns, reflections, and shared hope, a fragile web stretched across an endless landscape. And somehow that web holds. Morning comes slowly, as if the world is hesitant to lift its own frozen eyelids. The sky glows a pale, watery gold, thin light filtering through clouds that have finally exhausted themselves. The storm is not fully gone, but it has quieted to a subdued whisper, a tired exhale after days of relentless fury. You stand at the edge of what used to be a road and now resembles a white canyon, its walls rising taller than you ever imagined snow could climb. Today is the day people begin to dig. Not because it's easy, and not because conditions have truly improved, but because staying sealed inside any longer feels impossible. Historians still argue whether the turning point for survivors came from necessity or from sheer psychological breaking point. Fringe accounts, though, insist the moment arrived all at once, an unspoken collective decision sparked simply by the thin ribbon of sunlight that morning. You lift a shovel from a porch buried almost completely beneath a drift, only the curved handle visible. People inside must have pushed it outward through a vent, leaving it like a small invitation for anyone passing by. You brush off the frost, feel the wood grain under your glove, and inhale the kind of air that stings but doesn't slice. It's still freezing, but compared to the storm at its height, it feels merciful. Ahead of you, snowbanks glow faintly in the morning light, sculpted into curving shapes almost too beautiful to disturb. But beauty doesn't outweigh necessity. Digging must begin. The first cut you make into the drift releases a puff of powder as if the snow is exhaling. You hear faint movement inside the house, a family shifting, hopeful. Some homes, trapped beneath 10, 15, even 20 feet of snow, have made it through the storm only to realize escape won't come without effort. Fringe stories describe households starting their escape from the second floor or even the attic, tunneling downward toward daylight like moles. Historians still debate whether such stories are exaggerated, but multiple diaries from the era mention ropes tied to beams, makeshift ladders, and people squeezing through vents to reach the thin wedge of sunlight outside. Your digging becomes rhythmic. Dig, lift, toss. The muscles in your arms burn, but it's a satisfying kind of ache, the kind that promises progress. A few houses away, you see another figure doing the same, then another. The sound of shovels, at first faint and uncertain, grows into a chorus, metal scraping, snow thudding, voices muffled behind drifts. It's the first true sign that community is waking. At one buried house, you hear shouting, a small, jubilant cry followed by laughter. You hurry over. A child's mittened hand pokes through a small hole in the snow wall near the roof line. Her family responds frantically, digging outward as she digs inward. Within minutes, the wall collapses in a small cascade, revealing their faces, red-cheeked, tired but alive. One quirky account from this era mentions children being the fastest tunnelers because their small hands fit into narrow spaces. You believe it now, watching this child wriggle free first, giggling despite it all. More homes begin to emerge. You watch as someone hauls up a ladder to climb out through a collapsed chimney. Another family appears from a tunnel dug through their kitchen window, snow spilling behind them like foam from a shaken bottle. Historians still argue whether these escapes happened simultaneously or in waves. But standing here, you feel the surge of energy sweeping through the community. A team of neighbors gathers near the schoolhouse, which sits half buried like a forgotten relic. They shovel together, coordinating silently with practiced rhythm. You join them, falling into sync. The camaraderie warms you more than any fire could. Fringe stories claim that blizzards forged friendships stronger than blood. Watching these people, some who barely spoke before now working shoulder to shoulder, you can't help but believe it. Animal rescues begin next. Someone calls for help near a barn whose roof has partially caved. A small group rushes over. You follow. Inside, cows and horses huddle together, their breaths rising in clouds. The animals look startled but largely unharmed. A farmer counts them with trembling hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. All accounted for. A sheepdog bounds through the doorway, tail wagging furiously, having somehow survived half buried in straw. You see tears slip from the farmer's eyes, freezing instantly on his lashes. One mainstream historical fact often noted in accounts from this era is how livestock not only survived but provided warmth to families who sheltered near them. Some households even slept in barns during the storm, cocooned between wooden walls and the steady, grounding presence of animals. You continue digging pathways between homes, connecting them like veins reuniting after being severed. More neighbors emerge, some blinking in the light, others crying quietly, overwhelmed by relief. The storm's aftermath has left a landscape transformed. Fences gone, trees bent under shimmering coats of ice, roofs flattened, sheds erased entirely. Yet people stand in the snow, shaking hands, clapping backs, checking on one another. Historians still debate whether communities instinctively turned outward after the storm or whether social pressure pushed them into collective action. Fringe tales say it wasn't logic or duty, it was simple human yearning. You head toward the town's center, navigating snow corridors carved by dozens of hands. A makeshift ladder leans against the church steeple, the only visible part of the building. Someone is ringing the bell not for a service but as a signal. We're here, we made it, come find us. The sound carries across the frozen fields, soft but clear. It's the first organized communication you've heard since the storm began. You pause and let the bell's vibrations settle into your chest. The moment feels almost sacred. The general store, too, has become a hub. Residents dig toward it like ants excavating a buried nest. Inside, people share supplies, candles, canned goods, wool blankets. One fringe anecdote claims that during a similar historic blizzard, a store owner declared a snow amnesty, letting anyone take what they needed without paying. Whether true or embellished, you feel echoes of that spirit now. People aren't counting coins, they're counting neighbors. Rescue parties form quickly. You join one heading to a farmhouse on the outskirts reported to have gone silent. The trek is exhausting, snow still deep, drifts uneven, wind stubborn, but you push on. When you reach the house, you find a tunnel already begun from the inside. You dig toward it, calling out. A faint voice answers. When the wall finally gives way, you find the family huddled inside, weak but alive. Their relief washes over you like warm water. Historians still debate how many such rescues occurred in the blizzard's wake, but almost every community has tales of neighbors saving neighbors in ways that remain retold for generations. On your way back, you spot something unusual. A tall stick rising from the snow with a strip of red cloth waving gently. It marks a ventilation hole for a house completely buried. You kneel beside it and call downward, your voice echoing faintly. A reply comes. A man and his elderly mother, alive and rationing their supplies. You reassure them that help is coming. It strikes you how thin the line is between life and tragedy. sometimes only inches of packed snow separating families from rescue. You continue digging until your arms shake, until the sun weakens and dips toward the horizon. Even as dusk returns, people keep working. Lanterns appear in the snow corridors like floating fireflies. Children help carry small piles of snow. Carts loaded with blankets and hot food move between homes. The storm may have isolated everyone at its height, but its end has pulled people together with magnetic force. As night returns, you pause near a high drift overlooking the town, the same town that was nearly erased, now slowly reclaiming its shape. Chimneys poke through drifts like periscopes. Windows glow again. Smoke rises in winding ribbons. The world still looks foreign, but for the first time in days it feels alive. You think back to earlier sections, about frostbitten fingers, muffled breaths, tapping codes, periscopes made of pipes, lantern signals, and snow tunnels carved with hope more than skill. Now you see all those fragile threads weaving together into something resilient. Historians still argue whether communities emerge stronger or simply more aware after disasters like this. But fringe accounts insist the transformation is real and lasting, that once people crawl out of the snow, they never see their neighbors or their own strength the same way again. You take one last deep breath. The air is still painfully cold, but it tastes like promise. Tomorrow, rebuilding begins. But tonight, survival itself is enough. And now, as the last lanterns dim and the digging quiets, your mind drifts with the soft hush of settling snow. The world outside your thoughts begins to soften too. The sharp edges of the storm blur, the bright cold fades into gentler shades, and every sound grows slower, rounder, softer. You can almost hear the snow itself relaxing at last, easing into its own stillness after so many restless days. Your breath slows. Your shoulders loosen. You let the imagery thin out, like clouds stretching across a pale sky. Those towering drifts become small, familiar hills in the distance. The tapping signals from buried neighbors fade into faint echoes, comforting rather than urgent. The lanterns glowing in tunneled pathways dim to warm embers. You're not digging anymore. You're not bracing against the wind. You're simply drifting on the after silence, carried gently by the calm that always follows upheaval. Even the cold begins to feel far away, more like a memory than a sensation. The world grows warmer in small, steady waves. You picture roofs rising from the snow, children laughing again, fires crackling in safe rooms. You picture yourself stepping back from the frozen landscape, wrapped in quiet reassurance. Everything slows, everything softens, everything settles. And as that soft calm spreads gently through you, you let yourself lean into the moment with the faintest exhale. The storm is behind you. The night is peaceful again, and you've made it safely through to the other side. Sweet dreams.